This meeting is called to order. Welcome to a workshop meeting of the Board of Directors of the Vallecitos Water District for Wednesday, April 27, 2022 at 5 p.m. at the district office. Next, could we have the Pledge of Allegiance led by Director Sinella?
Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next is roll call. Please indicate your attendance. And it looks like we're all here. Okay, next is additions to the agenda. I have no proposed additions, so we'll move on to adoption of tonight's agenda.
Move to approve.
Second.
Been moved by Director Hernandez, seconded by Director Boyd Hodgson to approve tonight's adopt tonight's agenda. Please vote. And it carries unanimously. Okay, moving on. We come to the public comment. This is for persons wishing to address a matter not on tonight's agenda. You may be heard at this time, however, no action will be taken until the matter is placed on a future agenda in accordance with board policy. Public comments are limited to 3 minutes. A request to speak form is required to be submitted to the executive assistant prior to the start of the meeting if possible. Public comment should start by stating name, address, and topic. The board is not permitted during this time to enter into a dialogue with the speaker. Is there anyone who wants to speak at this time on a matter not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. Okay, before we get to our workshop agenda item, I've got a few opening remarks, basically procedural comments I'd like to go over. Okay, so the purpose of tonight's workshop is to continue the discussion about the district's capacity funds and the differences in finances between our ratepayers' funds and capacity funds. Thank you all for coming to today's workshop. This is a very complex issue involving policy, financial, and legal aspects. Staff will start the workshop by making a presentation. You'll hear from our general manager, our assistant general manager, and our finance manager. The board will ask clarifying questions, or they may ask clarifying questions as the presentations progress. I ask that you hold your questions and comments until after staff has completed their presentations. As with other public meetings, each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes. Keep in mind the board makes the decisions it feels are in the best interest of all of its customers in a manner that complies with applicable laws and prudent financial practices. I ask that we maintain decorum at all times, allowing each other to speak when we've each been recognized. So are there any general questions before we begin the presentation?
Could you pull your microphone a little closer?
Sure.
We're having trouble hearing.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, any questions about procedure tonight? Okay, seeing none, I'd like to turn the meeting over to our general manager, Perun.
All right, thank you, President Ellitharp. Can everyone hear me? Okay, sounds good. Good evening, directors and members of the public. Thank you all for coming out today. As President Ellitharp mentioned, this is a complex issue. You're going to hear staff talk about things like master plans, capacity fees, equivalent dwelling units, debt issuance, reserve levels. These are a lot of topics that we realize that the public's not really familiar with. Some are more familiar with than others, and we'll try to explain those as best we can as we move forward. And given the highly technical nature and the multiple components in the presentation today, it's likely that not everybody will agree on the issues. So I don't think we're all going to get to a meeting of the minds, but hopefully we'll have good dialogue as we go along. So before we dive into these issues, I want to provide a simple diagram that I think illustrates how the district manages its public funds. And if you can go to the next slide. So this is pretty simplistic, but we have two basic lines of business that we operate. We have a water system and we have a wastewater system, right? So there's kind of left and right side on the display here. And with each one of those, you can click again, Within each of those lines of business, there are two funds established. One is for operating the existing system, the pipes and everything that's in the ground already, and the other is for adding capacity to serve future development. And that's what this differentiation is vertically, either on the replacement side or on the capacity side. So at its most basic level, we have four funds, two in the water, two in the wastewater. It's a pretty simplistic model, but I think it's relatable for the discussion we want to have today. And revenues that are received for water purposes are kept in the water fund. Revenues that are brought in on the wastewater side are kept in the wastewater fund. And similarly, revenues that are received for the operation of the existing system are kept in one fund, and revenues received for future capacity are kept in another fund. So you'll find that monies stay within a quadrant. It comes in from a quadrant and goes out from that quadrant to whatever costs are to be incurred. And monies are never actually moved between funds or used for purposes other than for the purpose those funds were received. And even when the district's capacity funds were experiencing a shortfall, funds were never transferred from the ratepayers' funds to the capacity funds. This isn't the first time we've met publicly to discuss these issues. We've had public meetings on this topic on numerous occasions, and I'm not going to go over the list, but the list is in front of you here. And I think there was 15 separate meetings that covered topics including the capacity fund, capital facility fees, the timing of the collection of the capacity fees. We've talked about the reserve policy. We've talked about the issuance of debt. That was a hot topic last year when we actually did issue debt. And we've made numerous presentations about our water rates. Back in February of 2020, the board actually approved a rate increase. That was over 2 years ago. But most recently, the board did hear a conversation just last week on April 20th about a cost of service study update to talk about the next step. None of the issues that have been brought to our attention from the public are new, and I think we've addressed all of them before. A small group of ratepayers has raised concerns regarding the capacity fund deficit. And as I mentioned, as we know, that deficit has been erased. The district issued $28 million in debt back in August of 2021. The debt service payments to repay that debt will be made from the fees collected from developers. Ratepayers will never pay a dime of that money to service that debt, and that's a good thing. And although there were deficits in both the water and wastewater funds, there were like I said before, there was no money transferred from one to the other to pay it. And those deficits never caused the replacement fund reserve levels to be higher than they would have otherwise been. So whether the district had a deficit in the capacity funds or not, it did not affect the replacement reserve levels that the ratepayers are mostly concerned about. And although most of the concerns have focused around the capacity fund, staff will be talking tonight about the capital facility fees, rates, and reserves, because these four topics are all interrelated. You can't separate one from the other easily. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Assistant Manager Gumpel, who will outline the technical and legal foundations required in order to discuss the financial issues that will be addressed by Wes Owen, our Finance Manager. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to James, and at the end, after Wes is done talking, I'll do a little closure before we turn it over to the board. So James, take it away.
Thank you, General Manager Prum, President Eltharp, members of the board. So I'm basically, the purposes of the workshop, I'm going to do the part one. Wes is the star of the show with part two. But really, today, we're going to set up the foundational knowledge for the subjects related to the master plan and the capacity fee study, or otherwise known as the Nexus study. I'm going to go over the process, the actual master plan process. And don't worry, even though I would love to do a 4-hour master plan presentation, I'm not going to torture you through that today. It will come, but not today. I'm going to identify what a master plan is and how it's implemented. I'm going to walk through the rules, laws, the best practices, and the limits, because yes, there are limits within a master plan. I'm going to set the basis for what the capacity fees are and how we charge them to new development from a master planning process and from the capacity fee process. Within the Nexus study, we're going to identify the same thing. What is a Nexus study and how it interacts with the master plan. We're going to discuss those rules, laws, and limits within those for the Nexus study itself. And this will basically lay the foundation for where it's going to take off from part two, which will be Wes's presentation. So let's start with the pieces of the master plan. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one slide. because we're not going to go over every piece in detail. But if you ever want to know, I'd be more than happy to talk about it. So first off, the 2018 master plan is a comprehensive water, sewer, and recycled water master plan, which also includes our integrated water resource plan. It's a lot of stuff, okay? So it takes about 2 years to put together and about $1 million. It also is performed by expert consultants and takes a tremendous amount of staff resources. And that is what it takes to put together a comprehensive master plan. Our 2018 master plan is actually a highly regarded document for its completeness. Staff and also the consultant who put this together have been asked to give numerous presentations at local and regional professional groups, and we've even presented at conferences, AWWA and utility management conferences. Going with that, let's start talking about the pieces of the master plan. And I'm going to start out with a couple foundational pieces here. One is land use. And what land use is basically, well, first off, what we use on our master plan is the approved adopted land use from the land use agencies. And I'll go into a little bit more details in the next slide. And what the land use is basically the jurisdiction, like a city, for example, says, in this piece of property, you could put 50 homes, or you could put condos, or you could put commercial, or it's going to be open space. That's what, when I say land use, that's the meaning. The next foundational item that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on later in this presentation is the future growth projections. Now, again, the district doesn't do this. It's done by a third party, the San Diego Association of Governments, SANDAG, and they do a 20-year projection on how much growth. So in other words, the cities tell you what type of growth, condos, homes, parks, businesses, and SANDAG tells us how fast that growth and how much growth is coming. So between the two foundations, we know what type of growth and when, approximately. From there, we start developing what we call duty factors or use factors. And what those are is, we need to know a certain type of development, a condo complex. How much water does it use? How much sewer does it generate? Now here, we really start diving into data. And for us, and you've heard Mike from the finance group talk about his 200 and something thousand lines of data, and it's very impressive, but for us, we use over 1.3 million lines of data. Now, we don't do it every year, Mike, but so every 5+ years, we're looking at this data, and the reason we do this is we know definitively through our water meters, and we even have sewer meters to know how much sewer is coming back, how much a certain development, how much a commercial complex uses. Because a lot of times, the development community will argue that, no, we don't use that much water. Well, we have definitive data that is solid and unrefutable, basically, to help support, and that's based on our existing meter records. We also look at historical averages. We project them. We want to get a trend. Are we using more? Are we using less? Are the drought type of efforts, low flow toilets, efficiencies, are they taking effect? Or do they take effect immediately, but over time, or is it still working? We look at what's the standards in the industry, the laws and regulations, what's changing. Also, we have a design criteria, and here is kind of where the rubber starts meeting the road, because we plan for the design criteria, how big our pipes need to be, what facilities need to be built. That's carried forward when we condition development, carried forward when we inspect and build CIPs, and even carried forward when we maintain, or our operations group maintains the facilities. And that initial work on the design criteria basically lays the foundation for the level of service. And when we compare ourselves to national agencies, to regional agencies, even other local agencies, Vallecitos always performs in best in class from a level of service standpoint. Number of main breaks, interruption of service, we're best in class in almost every category. And a lot of that has to do with, it starts at the design criteria, but really is met with our operations staff maintaining and operating our system. We have a comprehensive water sewer model. This is a hydraulic model that is based on our actual GIS, our Geographic Information System. And we put all this information into that GIS model, and it spits out what will be our CIP. So these are just the inputs. Okay, now we've done all this work to get the inputs. From there, we move forward, and we create the CIP. and the capital improvement program. Now, for the 2018 master plan and the 2008 master plan and the 2002 master plan, all our master plans pretty much, at least back to 2002, it is a growth-only document. In other words, there's not a single CIP in our master plan that is a pure replacement. Every project is triggered by growth. And I'm going to be coming back to that concept a little later in this presentation. So our master plan doesn't have any burden that's a pure ratepayer burden. It is basically a 100% growth-driven document. So after that, we produce what we call a programmatic ER. This is the environmental process and also starts to kick off our public outreach process. Obviously, every CIP has an environmental footprint, and we need to study that to make sure we're doing the right thing. So these are our outputs. So from there, we're kind of done with the master plan, but we're not done with the process. After that, we start our general public outreach. We go ahead and reach out to our NGOs or environmental groups that may have concerns and may make comments within our programmatic EIR. We reach out to what we call the BIA, the Building Industry Association and Development Community, because they're also part of this master plan. This affects them. And that's our public and outreach for stakeholders. Here we transition. We transition to the capacity fee study. And within the capacity study, we have another set of rules. We have the Mitigation Fee Act and other laws. The capacity fee study, or the Nexus study, then is actually performed and developed. And just as kind of a reminder, the intent of the study is to determine how the costs of the CIP are allocated and how those projects will be collected, the costs will be collected from those projects or for those projects over time. Now, as you can see, I didn't do the puzzle perfectly here. It doesn't quite match up because there's another component. And this is the component that is most debated, usually by the development community, every now and then by public or stakeholders, definitely by some of the environmental agencies. And what that is flexibility. Everybody assumes that the district has a wide breadth of flexibility on how we can manipulate these inputs and these outputs to basically get a different result. In reality, if you want to make your document defendable, and our master plan has been challenged. It was challenged in 2002, it was challenged in 2008, and it was challenged in 2018. To make the document defendable, you have to follow all these steps without shortcutting them. And then when you're done with that, there's very little flexibility left. So let's talk about a couple of those, what I call foundational inputs. Let's start with land use. So land use is a foundational input in the master plan. The district is not a land use agency. Like I mentioned before, it tells us what type of growth, whether it's condos, homes, business park, and where that is. This actual parcel of land will be commercial according to the land use agencies. These are the listed land use agencies within our district. San Marcos, just by itself, has a lot of immediate growth. I mean, common sense, you can look around, you can see the growth in San Marcos, and that's not even the planned growth they have. They have tremendous amount of planned growth that's kind of, according if they follow their plan, is going to hit the city of San Marcos within the next 15 to 20 years. The county actually also has tremendous growth, but their growth is pushed further back. Their growth plan, which is still significant, is 15 to 30 plus years out. And obviously not nearly as robust as the city of San Marcos. Those two agencies probably make up 90-something% of our total projected growth. So currently, our current master plan, the 2018 master plan, which we started way back in 2014, actually has the current adopted general plans, the land use plans, both for the city of San Marcos and the county of San Diego. They have not updated their document. So if we start a new master plan today, we'd be using the same foundational information as we have in our current master plan. So the district also, within our development process, actually performs what we call a water sewer study for each new development, and we compare it to the master plan. The reason we do this is because the city and even the county has a way to change their land use. They call it a special planning area or a SPA. And so as an example, they could take an area that has been approved for 50 homes and say, oh, you could build 300 condos on it. And we see it's happening. So back in 2008, for the 2008 master plan, staff realized this and started implementing a new process, and we call it a water sewer study. Some other agencies call it a SAMP, which is a sub-area master plan, okay? And that's to compare what the city is actually allowing, what the developer is actually building, compared to what was assumed in our master plan. And we do this to ensure that the master plan is made whole and that we're not putting undue burden on the district or its ratepayers. And we've been doing this basically since right around 2010. Yeah, but we don't advertise it, so this is probably the first time people are hearing that. So the city of San Marcos is currently working on the general plan, and it's estimated to complete sometimes in 2023. I believe we have a member of the general plan advisory committee on here. I've been part of that process, and they actually started earlier. It would have been done, but due to COVID, they actually suspended the process, and they've picked it back up now. Now that they've picked it back up, we kind of have a horizon, something to shoot for that may make a foundational change in our master plan. So the second input that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on is the future growth. Okay, again, like I mentioned, that comes from Sandag, and they project it over 20 years. They do 5-year population increments, so they kind of give you an estimate every 5 years. So this way we could kind of spread out our CIP, what needs to be done to accommodate this growth every 5 years. Our current master plan has a population projection that Sandag did based on the 2010 census. So it's dated. The new 2020 census is out, so that's good news. However, the new Sandag population growth, they haven't done it yet. And they're estimated to be done with that sometime in 2023. So sometime in 2023, hopefully earlier than later, we will have new foundational information on land use and population growth. Until then, if I were to start a new master plan, let's say next year, we'd get about halfway to 3/4 way through it. This new foundational information would be out. We'd spend maybe $1/2 to $750,000 of district money, and then we'd end up putting it in the recycle bin because we'd have to start over. So ultimate demands, we use the land use, and we start projecting. We put everything in, so not only do we understand that 20-year horizon, we understand what the ultimate goals of the cities are in the county for ultimate demands. We may never reach those ultimate demands, but we have to have an understanding of how that would affect the district so we could plan accordingly. I'm going to jump right to the capacity fees because a lot of the other areas in the master plan, which I'd love to go through, may bore you to death. But like I said, if you ever want to sit down for about 4 hours, let me know. So again, as a reminder, the capacity fee is how we allocate those CIP costs and also kind of the plan of how we charge for those projects over time. And some of the objectives are to review and comply with the legal framework, utilize obviously the CIP adopted from the master plan, and look at the methodology, a buy-in method, an incremental method, or a hybrid method. Obviously there's a stakeholder and public process with that. We look at an adoption fee schedule. Oops, a little too fast. And then as far as the laws, and I'm not going to go over a lot of laws because I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. So, but a couple things that we took out from our capacity fee presentation are looking at the different laws, and there's a lot of them. And obviously we got the California Constitution, but we have the Mitigation Fee Act. And there's also several case laws that revolve around distinguishing the difference between what can be done in a capacity fee compared to a developer impact fee, and another set of case law that supports growth pays for growth incremental methodology. So within the Mitigation Fee Act, I kind of highlighted a couple things. Shall not exceed the estimated reasonable cost for providing service. And from a common sense standpoint, what that really means is the costs that we put in the CIP have to be reasonable. We can't just burden costs without a reasonable nexus. The second part are proportional benefits to the person or property being charged, in this case development. What that really means is we need to allocate the cost correctly. We can't double dip. If we're already charging and collecting the money one way, we can't find another way to charge. If it was challenged, we would lose that challenge. And I'm going to demonstrate kind of how this works graphically a little later in my presentation. So let's talk about the methodology because I know there's been some questions on that. So the methodology is defined in the American Water Works Association M1 manual. And the buy-in method is based on the value of the existing system's capacity. So Typically, this is used when growth is minimal and the system capacity is sufficient to meet future growth. So a pure buy-in method at this point is not appropriate for the district. And you can look around and look at our city, the amount of growth that's happening. If we were to stop building now, our facilities could not accommodate that growth. So a pure buy-in method really wouldn't make a lot of sense. And a city such as San Marcos that has a tremendous amount of growth, it would. If the city was completely built out and maybe just some redevelopment here and there, people, knock down a one-story house, put up a two-story house, that'd be a different story. But that's not the situation that we currently are in. And if you look at the city's general plan, that's not the story that we will be in the near future. We may be transitioning to that over time, but we're not there yet. Incremental methodology. So this methodology is typically used when the existing system has limits or no capacity to serve new development now and or in the future. So obviously there's significant growth. If you look around within the city of San Marcos, you can see that growth. And our system capacity can't handle it. We cannot convey the sewer to our treatment plants. We cannot deliver fire flow to these customers and to our future residents without additional facilities being built. Our master plan projects are triggered by growth. And I want to kind of spend a little bit of time on this. So growth is projected to occur, and the master plan is kind of a snapshot in time. We have a method of kind of adjusting that because we look at the actual growth when it occurs and the actual pressure and basically on our system. So if our system's being over leveraged, we know that we have to build those facilities. So we try to time it appropriately. So the hybrid method is kind of a blend of both. And you know what, actually, transition to this method is actually ongoing. In the current capacity fee study, we actually spent a significant amount of time with our consultant looking at buy-in method process, looking at possible buy-in method projects. And based on the new master plan, depending on the foundational changes, we're going to look at it again. And over time, we foresee ourselves starting to go into this hybrid method where we have an expansion component and a buy-in component. And over many, many, many more years, much probably past my time at the district, we'll probably transition to a full buy-in method. But it's going to take some time because we have to be done with growth. Or we have to overbuild so much, which is not really an advantage, to accommodate that future growth. So here's a couple graphical examples, and these are fairly accurate, but I won't say if they're 100%, but it gives everybody the gist of what we're talking about. Here's our sewer infrastructure. It's roughly 300 miles of pipe. Now, it's adequately sized for the most part. In other words, majority of 300 miles, 290-ish miles of pipe are in your neighborhoods. There is no reason for us to go out and rip out pipes in your personal neighborhoods to put in bigger lines. It doesn't make any sense, right? Or they're already fully paid for, or they're already within our capacity fee model, which means the upsizing is being paid for through our development fees, our capacity fees. So if I gray out everything that meets that metric, which is, they never need to be upsized, they're already fully funded, or they're funded already and allocated within our capacity fees, so, we can't double dip for them. I'll gray everything out, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. It's pretty much everything, okay? Now, when I take a little deeper dive, saying, okay, let me double check this, and this is a process that we went through for our actual Nexus study, our capacity fee study, for the 2018 master plan. So we actually did this process already. We actually do see some projects, okay? Our Encina Phase 5 expansion, our Metal Arc plant expansion, Linda Vista, San Marcos Sewer Interceptor, which is portions of it's coming to the board here soon for adoption, Rock Springs. So let's take a closer look at those projects. All those projects are either already included in our capacity fee or they're already debt financed. So if we added a buying component to those projects, we'd be essentially double dipping. And I believe if we double dip and got challenged, I imagine we wouldn't go far. So, and it's just not the right thing to do. You can't charge twice for the same project. Water system, very, very similar type story. Instead of 300 miles, now it's more like 500 miles of pipe, okay? Again, I'm gonna take everything out that's that meets those same metrics of being paid for, already included, or, and I forgot to say this on the sewer, but this is true for sewer and water. The majority of your in-tract, so where you live, those facilities were 100% built by, installed, and paid for by the developer who built your neighborhood. So the district incurred zero direct costs for those facilities. So there is no cost to allocate, from at least from different methodologies. So again,
Hey, James, can I just ask?
Sure, go ahead.
I think that's a really important point. I just want to make sure that, I think it's worth repeating. Any existing neighborhood that's been built in the past, all of the water and wastewater infrastructure, 100% of it was put into the ground by the developer, paid for by the developer. Also, any future development that may come, or current development that's taking place today, 100% of the water and wastewater infrastructure for that neighborhood is paid for by the developer. Is that accurate?
yeah, it is pretty much, for the most part, I would have to go back all the way in history into the
Well,
set, yeah, but
let's
yes.
just say the last
Absolutely.
20 years.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
So,
But that's important because that's a good, your presentation is very comprehensive, but also even I'm kind of like, whoa, where are you going? And I'm trying to kind of, does development pay for development, right? And so I think it's a good baseline to start with, that when a neighborhood is either being built today or in the future, the developer is responsible to pay for all of the wastewater and water infrastructure for their own development.
yeah, and not only that, through our water sewer study process, we actually locate and find off-site facilities that they have to build because they're increasing density. They have that bonus and it affects our system, and we want to make sure that burden is on the development because they're the one causing it and not our ratepayers.
James, also translating that, the ultimate homeowner is the one that's paying for it. The developer isn't doing this for free. He's taking those costs and put it into his project, and then the homeowner that's purchasing the home or the whatever is the one that's paying for it. Likewise, in the future, the same thing will happen.
It's a valid point, Jim, but I think it confuses the matter, right? I think most people will understand that if a developer is forced to pay for something, they're probably going to tack it on to the price of the home. They're not gonna, it'll end up ultimately being, it's just like when gas prices go up, groceries go up, right? I think we all know that. But the fact of the matter is, it is the developer who is responsible to pay for their own infrastructure for their own project, and not current ratepayers.
Correct.
That's correct, and how they get reimbursed for them is most likely through home sales.
Yes, correct.
So again, in this case, it's similar story. There's two large projects on our water system, our big storage reservoirs, the 33 million gallon tank, which actually has reached allocation at this point, but our 40 million gallon tank has not, still has capacity remaining. But again, both those projects were debt financed, but they're not in the master plan, on the current master plan, because they were already built. However, we still had debt financing from our previous master plan and our previous studies that are still moving forward, because that debt lasts over 20 or 25 years or longer. So again, same story. It's doing a buy-in method with these projects would be essentially double dipping on the fees or on the costs. So a little bit about how we allocate costs, because at the end of the day, the district needs to do the right thing and allocate proper costs, or else we'll be challenged. So here's an example of a project, and this is right out of our CIP. Any public member could go on our website and look at any of our CIPs over the course of several years and see what the cost allocations are. So just to kind of give a highlight, you're looking at a project, the San Marcos Interceptor, which is about $8.75 million. But there's an existing pipe there. So 71% in this case of the project, and I know it's kind of small up there, I apologize for that, is directly in the cap fee. So and 29% is coming out of replacement because there's an existing pipe there. The development pressure is causing that pipe to increase by 71%. Now, you can't build half a pipe. So once we once there's enough pressure on that system where we're going to spill, the pipe's gonna break, something's gonna happen, we have to plan accordingly and we have to build the system. Now, if we built the proper size for now, that means every 5 years we'll be going back into the roads and putting a one size bigger pipe. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It costs a lot of money. And it costs the ratepayers a lot of money because every time you do that, they're paying for the majority of it. So in this case, we're going to the biggest pipe that we know we need based on our master plan. 71% of the costs are burdened upon our developers, which is collected through cap fees. But we know that there's going to be extra capacity in it. That's why it's debt finance, and that's why we're planning on collecting it over a long period of time. The money goes out today. We collect it over a long period of time with interest based on our debt financing. So cap fee general methodology. So really, the first step is we identify the CIP from the master plan. We figure out what the value of that CIP is, okay? And then we separate the costs, like I just showed you in the previous slide. We put the expansion portion to the development. We look at the replacement portion and we allocate those costs to the district replacement reserve. So that comes out of that replacement reserve. And as General Manager Pruma showed you, those are different buckets. So we separate the bucket from a project by project level, okay? Then we identify any buy-in components through existing debt and deficit. And we went through a kind of a painstaking process in the 2018 Master Plan cap fee presentation with our consultant for this. Staff went through this process and basically tried to identify the projects that would fit into that. And some of those examples are this. It's the Twin Oaks Reservoir number 2, which is our big 40 million gallon reservoir, our treatment plants expansions over time, our San Marcos interceptor. But they were already, according to our rate consultant, allocated through our cap fee model from our master plan or previous debt, and it'd be improper to kind of do a double dip. So when we calculate the fee, it's in a simplistic way. You get the total CIP cost plus any debt, plus any deficit, and you divide by what we call total EDUs. Let's call EDUs growth, the total amount of growth, okay? And we get a dollars per EDU. It's pretty darn simple. Now, what's funny, and I'm going to take you way back to the beginning of my presentation, that flexibility. This is where, usually from the development side, that the flexibility, hey, you guys need to change stuff. We need to lower those CIP costs without changing the growth number. Or in some cases, hey, the growth didn't happen, so you need to change, make that growth number smaller, which essentially ups the CIP cost. Well, the problem with both those statements are they're fundamentally incorrect because you can't change one without changing another. That's not how math works. It's a balance equation, okay? It's laws of math. You basically, the CIP costs are fully vetted and dependent on the growth numbers, and they're interconnected. So if you change one, you have to change the other. And this is an argument we have with the BIA and the development community constantly. You can't just lower the CIP and get rid of projects without lowering the amount of growth that caused those projects. So the master plan we know is a snapshot in time. So what we do is staff evaluates actual project needs based on actual project growth annually. The master plan is that snapshot in time, and we know that we need to adjust things. So did the growth not happen? Like the recession, for example. Well, how do we adjust things? And well, we basically do that by delaying projects. So the growth didn't happen, the expense didn't happen. So you have to look at the top of the equation and the bottom of the equation. Any argument that looks at one without the other is fundamentally flawed. So again, if the growth didn't happen, we end up pushing those projects out. Now, it's not one for one always, because again, you can't build half a pipe or half a tank, but that's why we allocate this, and that's why the CIP and the fees are projected over a long period. So essentially, it helps balance the top and bottom of the equation. And a couple quick examples of this, and you can look through on our website, on our previous budgets, and you can, two projects that just come to mind is our Meadowlark tank projects. We have a small tank that we're demoing. We're going to build 2 larger tanks in what we call our Meadowlark area. That project was supposed to be built in, I think, 2008, maybe 2007. The growth never happened in the region, so every year we just push that project. That project's several $1 million, $4 or $5 million. We push it, we push it, we push it. We never realized the bottom of that equation, the denominators, the growth, and we never realized the top of that equation, the cost. Another larger, more significant project is our land outfall. Our land outfall is tens of millions of dollars, 45, 50, 60 million dollars at the end of the day between all the segments, or maybe even more. We were supposed to start that project pre-recession, 2008, 2009, something like that. It's supposed to be in construction. The growth didn't happen. We haven't started that project. We're actually just starting our planning now because the growth has actually occurred. So the growth that was supposed to occur pre-recession didn't happen. So we're talking hundreds, if not maybe well over 1,000 EDUs, maybe thousands of EDUs that never occurred. Well, we also saved by not pushing a project that was tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars. It's not a perfect balance, but it balances out. And over time, anybody could take a snapshot today and say, oh, you're wrong. But if you take a step back and over time, it balances out, and it's meant to do so. So our anticipated schedule. So let's look at those foundational changes. Land use, 2023. Growth projections, 2023. Doing anything now with a master plan, it really wouldn't make a lot of sense because we'd waste staff time, resources, and money to do so, just to start over. And I hope that's clear. The one thing I want to make clear in this presentation is really that. The next master plan, possibly start in 2024. There's an 18 to 24 month period to complete a master plan. And it's going to be based on those foundational changes. We're going to update all the pieces that you saw in the inputs. And you know what? There may also be new state regulations that we have to take into account for water use restrictions. And then we're going to evaluate the facilities. What facilities do we have? What facilities are maybe oversized? And it's appropriate for a buying component. We actually already proposed this in our budget. So the master plan, the board hasn't seen this yet, is proposed in our new budget coming up that the board will be presented on to start, not next year, but start in fiscal year 2024, which puts the completion in 2026. New capacity study. Well, you can't start that until you adopt the master plan. So we're looking at starting that. It's a 3 to 6 month process with a board adoption in 2027. And that would mean our current fees have only been in place since 2020. That's 7 years for our current fees, which is not an unreasonable amount of time. So the existing capacity fee study, though, and the existing capacity fees, how do we adjust them? Well, they are adjusted every year. They're escalated annually. And staff actually does a deeper dive and evaluates them periodically to make sure, are we tracking? Are we doing an okay job balancing the top of that equation with the bottom of that equation? With that, what we covered today was really the master plan process, the timing of when it's appropriate to consider a new master plan, and it is in our proposed budget. It hasn't been adopted by the board yet. The CAP fee study process, balancing the cost of growth in calculation. Again, you can't change the top without adjusting the bottom and vice versa. We talked about evaluation of a buying component and transitioning to what I call a hybrid method. And we already did that. We already started that process in the current CAP fee. At the time, our consultant said, hey, we need to consider this, but it wasn't appropriate at the time. But we took that message. We know that it's going to come. It's going to come sooner or later. And understand the district's role. What is the district's role in facilitating the correct and equitable process to protect our ratepayers and charge the development community the appropriate fee? With that, hopefully I shed some light on the foundational information, and I can answer any questions. I'd be happy to.
Okay, thank you, James. Any questions from the board? Director Boyd Hudson.
Thank you, James, for this presentation. It was really comprehensive, and I appreciate all the work that you did to put it together. I would like to recommend that initial slide be included in new board members' orientation. I would like to make that recommendation. I do have a question, but first I'd like to acknowledge I am wearing jeans because today is Denim Day to recognize and promote sexual assault awareness and survivor awareness. So I wanted to acknowledge that. I do have a question. You mentioned that the water sewer study compares what developers are doing to what the master plan projected, and I was wondering what is the average variance that you find in what you've compared?
So many projects have no variance, but some of the larger projects like your University District or your Creek area, there has been variances in the past. And what it's caused is in our conditioning, because of that variance and what the study results, is upsizing pipes or actually installing new pipe that has not even been identified in the master plan. Because that development directly was the nexus for resulting that pipe being undersized.
And how do we, with that readjustment, how do we recover the appropriate fees for those readjustments?
There are no appropriate fees to recover. We're burdening that 100% on development because they caused it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions? Director Sedell?
Again, James, thank you for the comprehensive presentation, definitely a lot of information. I don't know if this is something that maybe Wes is going to cover or somebody else, but can we kind of simplify it a little bit and run through a hypothetical, right? And okay, a developer comes to Vallecitos, or they get approved by the city, they're going to build 10 homes. I'm using 10 just to keep it simple. I know 10 might not cause a big impact, but let's not get into that, right? The developer gets approved to build 10 homes. Vallecitos is going to get involved because at some point they're going to come into our system for water and wastewater. Can you kind of talk through what that looks like at a very simple level? The developer starts off by installing their own wastewater and water infrastructure. Then they pay us, Vallecitos, which is everybody in this room, a fee to come into our system. And then what else takes place after that before they actually sell their houses, build their houses and sell it? Like what does that look like? And really from the money piece of it, because I think that's why we're all here. Everybody wants to know, are developers paying their fair share? Are ratepayers subsidizing developers? So tell us what that looks like at a very simple, quick hypothetical example.
Sure, I'll start. So when a development comes in, they do that study, the water sewer study, to figure out what we need to do to condition them. And they pay 100% for that. And they pay 100%, they put a deposit down, and they pay 100% for our staff time. From there, we condition them, and obviously we go through a plan check process in which the developer pays 100% for our staff time on that. Then they actually build the infrastructure, which we inspect. Again, there's a deposit, which the developer pays 100% of that. Once they're done and the infrastructure is in and accepted, which the developer paid for, we bring it to the board for acceptance. After they're done for acceptance, they can start getting occupancies, and they pay the cap fees for those occupancies.
What are our cap fees currently?
I don't have the number handy, but I know I have staff here that does.
Wes and Mike's got it.
So I can't read it on my glasses, but where's it down there?
No, it isn't. 13,000, okay.
That's for wastewater.
So our wastewater fees are basically about $14,000, and
Water's over here.
water is about $8,500
Per unit.
per unit,
So
per home, basically.
So roughly, keeping it simple, $24,000-ish per unit. So for those 10, in this hypothetical, those 10 units, they would, after they've already put in all of their own infrastructure at their own cost, they would, in addition to that, basically write a check to our district for $240,000 in this hypothetical situation, because there's 10 units times 24,000, right?
Yes.
And so what happens after that? So now they've already made, and at this point, up to this point, has the district or our ratepayers contributed 1 penny to this development?
No, and after this point, it's now our ratepayers in those homes, and it's our facility. And then we start collecting, obviously, through our water bills and our sewer bills for maintenance and allocation for replacement of that facility way down the line, because obviously those facilities are expected to
So then
last.
after the developer, in this hypothetical, writes a check for $240,000, they sell their home to a normal resident, like all of us, and then at that time, the resident pays their water bills, just like we all do, and then there's a portion of the water bill that goes into reserves to help upkeep the system for everybody.
That's correct.
Yeah, and then they become us, right? After
Yep.
we were talking about as a development, now they're ratepayers.
Yeah,
just
they're like us.
Right.
Okay, but I didn't hear at any point, I know, I mean, we all get water bills, we kind of know how that works, but up to that point, I didn't hear any ratepayer involvement whatsoever.
No, so in almost all developments, that's the standard process.
Okay.
And there is no ratepayer money that's involved in that process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready for the
Yeah,
next.
I think Wes is gonna take charge right now.
Thank you, James. Good job.
I'll let you.
Is that a bottle of Vallecitos water right there?
Sure is.
Okay.
Straight from the fountain.
You're kind of showcasing it right there. I don't know if you're trying to
It's got a name.
market us or what. There you go.
You're not gonna chug that.
Make sure he's done.
No.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah. Oh, you got it.
No, it did disappear.
Yeah, we're.
Okay, don't open that. Try open it again. There it goes.
So, this presentation disappeared.
It vanished.
That's not good.
Okay, so that should, is that good or?
Minimize it.
Minimize it and share it, right?
And then scroll down. So that's scroll down. Or down.
And just hit share.
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, so Glenn, this is actually, I don't know if you want to go through this portion, it's kind of a repeat of the quadrants. I don't know if you need to present this, we can skip over it, okay. So it'll be shared, I'll just skip through it all. Okay. Good evening. Being the star of the show, that's a lot of pressure. And actually, I think the real star of the show here tonight is the audience. It's nice to see all these
Absolutely.
people here in the audience tonight, and we're always excited to share our policies and our financial plan with all of you, so thanks for coming. So
And Wes, what, as a reminder, what's your role with the district?
I am the finance manager at Vallecitos Water District. The finance manager.
Wes, would you mind pulling that a little closer to you so?
Sure can. Let me see if I can I got papers in the way. Okay, is that better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So good evening, President Elthart, members of the board. I'm excited to present on this topic tonight. It has actually become one of my favorite topics to present on, and it should be, because this will be the third time the third time I've presented on it. So this is the capacity fund presentation cubed. No, but in all seriousness, it is a very complicated, complex subject, as we've discussed, and it's interesting subject matter, so it should be fun to present on and interesting for hopefully everyone to see. So the next slide, this is our board workshop slide. So this isn't quite as interesting as the budget party page, but we do have some interesting graphics here to get us in a productive mood, so we'll start there. So next I want to go through the agenda for tonight. And first on the agenda is the purpose. We've received a lot of questions from constituents and ratepayers, and most of those questions seem to be focused on one major topic. So we'll talk about that topic tonight, and hopefully we can address it during the presentation. After that, we'll go into the district's reserve and our reserve structure. Then we'll talk about customer rates and the rate drivers and the revenue requirement. Next, we'll talk about our reserve policy and our replacement reserves. After that, we'll talk about the capacity fee timing and scenarios as far as how the capacity fee model should flow and how it should function. After that, we will go into the capacity reserves history, interesting story about how things were, where we were, and where we're going from there. And next will be our capacity shortfall action plan, and that's actually going to show where we're going in the future. And finally, our conclusion. So let's get started with the purpose. The purpose of tonight's presentation, and I think this was the common theme among the questions, is are ratepayers funding development? Are our water and sewer rates appropriate? So we will be answering that question during the presentation. In order to answer it, we have to look at the district's reserve structure. And we have two reserve funds, as General Manager Prum mentioned. I'm going to simplify them into just two funds instead of the water and sewer. We won't be breaking those out. So showing that here, we have the replacement fund. The replacement fund is established, and the reporting requirements are established by our reserve policy. And the replacement fund is where the operating revenues go, or the revenues from ratepayers. Our other fund is the capacity fund.
The reporting requirements for the capacity fund are established by Government Code Section 66013, also known and more interestingly known as the Mitigation Fee Act. And the Mitigation Fee Act actually says that those funds collected for capacity and for growth have to be reported separately and cannot be commingled with other funds. So that's why we have the two funds, and that's why we report it that way. And every month in the board packet, we have the reserve report, which you've all seen, and we've been very transparent with that. So in the replacement reserves, it is made up of our beginning balance, and then we have our operating revenues. And those are our revenues from rates. That's where the ratepayer money goes into the replacement fund. From there, we use that money to pay for our operating expenses, our replacement of existing infrastructure, and then you have your ending balance in the replacement fund. So you'll notice nothing in there has to do with growth projects, nothing has to do with developer fees. This is a replacement fund, and that's the fund that we use to track our ratepayer money.
And this replacement fund is how we maintain our system?
Correct.
Okay. Existing infrastructure, things break, things need to be maintained, they need to be serviced, whatever it might be, right? Just routine type of service and maintenance.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So next, we'll move on to the capacity fund. And as I mentioned, the reporting requirements are based on the Mitigation Fee Act. It's made up of the beginning balance in the fund, plus our capacity fees collected from developers. Those fees are used to pay for growth projects and any debt service related to financing those growth projects. And then you have your ending balance in the capacity fund. So as you can see, those are the growth funds, the developer fees, any debt issuance proceeds we get go into that fund for those specific projects. It's tracked and reported on separately and never commingled with the replacement fund. So next I really want to talk about the rates and rate drivers. In order to do that, I want to go into the replacement fund. And as we note, the operating revenues are the first thing in the replacement fund here. So, and those are actually collected from customer rates. So customer rates and the major drivers for customer rates are first our operating expenses, just our cost of operations. We have to operate at a certain level to provide stable water and reliable water to our customers. After that, we collect 180 days of operating expenses. Our reserve policy says we'll have 6 months of operating expenses in our operating reserves. And next, we have our replacement of existing infrastructure. So that's the replacement reserve, and the floor for the replacement of existing infrastructure as established by the reserve policy is 3 years of projected system replacement costs. So the minimum for replacement of existing infrastructure is 3 years plus the operating expenses. That's the minimum we can have in our reserves. So these are the major rate drivers and what establishes what we call our revenue requirement. The revenue requirement is what we use to develop rates. The revenue requirement is summed up and then allocated amongst the different customer bases, and that's how we get our rates. The major component of these rate drivers is our operating expenses, and the biggest single component or the biggest single thing in the operating expenses are our water purchases. We cannot sell water if we don't purchase water. More than 72% of our operating expenses are for water purchases. So when we get all of that, almost all of it except for what we get from leave name from the water authority. So when the water authority raises their rates to us, we have to pass those rate increases along to our customers. If 72% of your costs go up, you're almost forced to raise rates to customers.
Hey, Wes, I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
Could you explain why we have such requirements in the reserve policy as 180 days of operating reserves?
Yes, and I'm going to go more into our actual reserve policy and how it's established, but it's based on industry best practices from the GFOA and the CSDA. And I have a couple slides on that coming up, including a very exciting bucket approach for our reserve policy. A couple of the members here have already seen it.
Okay, Director Snell, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, you might answer this in your upcoming slides about the policy, but these drivers and this policy that you're referring to on how we basically come up with our rates, when was this policy established?
2004.
2004.
Initially, it was written in 2004.
Okay. Has there been any changes since 2004?
Yes, we've had 4 different reiterations of the policy.
Okay, and so when was the last reiteration?
2014.
Okay, 2014. When did you take your position that you're in now?
2018.
4 years later.
Yes.
Okay. Who was in your position before you?
The former, actually, John Fusco he was the former finance manager.
Okay. Who was the head of the district's finance in 2014?
That was Tom Scaglione. He was the assistant general manager and CFO.
Okay, so this policy has not changed since the former finance manager left. So these are the policies that we were under the former
Yes.
finance manager, and nothing's changed since then.
No.
Okay, thank you.
So the major component of the operating expenses are our water purchases, and I mentioned that 72% of our operating expenses are water purchases. And worth noting is that since 2020, and I think we've already discussed that our last rate increase was in February 27, 2020. That rate increase was for 3.3%, Vallecitos rate increase. Our costs from the Water Authority during that same time frame from 2020 to 2022 have increased by over 8%. So we've only passed through 3.3% of those costs. So that's just to kind of give you factual information on our rate increases. So next I want to talk about that actual rate increase, the process we went through. So in our cost of service study in 2019, we contracted Raftellus Financial Consultants to perform a review of our cost of service study and our rate structure. So they did that, and they amended the existing cost of service study, and they reviewed our rate structure. And at a public hearing on February 27, 2020, Todd Cristiano, who is a senior manager at Raftellus, is quoted as saying, "Our revenue requirement only recovers operations and maintenance expenses and capital reserve requirements. So stated differently, it excludes growth-related costs." So our consultants made it clear, our rates do not include growth-related costs. Next, I want to talk about as promised, the district's reserve policy. And just to give you a little history, and we've talked a little about this already too through questions, the district's reserve policy was written in 2004. It was written at that time by, I believe, he was the finance manager, later became the AGM. He wrote the policy, and it was later reviewed by the GM, by the Finance and Investment Committee, and by the attorneys who helped him develop the policy. And through further and subsequent reiterations, that policy was developed using industry best practices by experts, and those experts include our financial advisors, Feldman and Rowlett. And also worth noting is it was reviewed during our last debt issuance in August. When we went through the issuance process, our debt management policy and our reserve policy were reviewed by Feldman and Rowlett, and we've got correspondence and their comments on that. You saw the debt management policy, we brought that to the board. We had one change we had to make to that to be in compliance. The reserve policy, they said they were fine with it. They had some questions about our replacement reserve levels, but overall they thought it was a good policy and it was sufficient to meet our needs. So going into the reserve policy, as I mentioned, it's established using industry best practices, and those best practices are from the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, and the California Special Districts Association. And those best practices establish the purpose, objectives, and guidance on how to develop a reserve policy. And what that guidance says, and actually before I go there, I wanted to mention that one of the constituents' questions was actually in regards to the best practices, and it was more of a comment. It said the GFOA's best practices recommended using a percentage of the total capital budget as your reserve policy floor. That was just a for instance in the policy, in the best practices. They said, for instance, you could use 20% of your 5-year replacement costs. It wasn't the best practices, it was just a for instance or a possibility. What the industry best practices actually say and how to establish a reserve policy, and this is the key, is that every agency and district needs to identify the uniqueness of that district and tie their reserves to their financial plan. Every agency is different. Every agency has different needs. You need to identify those and tie them to your financial plan. That's the best practice recommendation. Next, they say that reserves need to be clearly identified by category and purpose and tied to meaningful targets. And to determine how much reserves is enough, you need to ask the question, does it meet your plan? And we ask that question every year as we go through the budget process. You've seen our reserve presentations. Is actually we have the graphs now in our budget document where we show our projections for reserves. They're within our floor and our ceiling, and we've got the appropriate and sufficient levels of reserves. So we ask that question every year. Next, I'm going to go through the promised exciting bucket approach slide, and I did borrow this from a previous presentation. But for those of you who know him, Russell's going to help us go through the bucket approach on our reserve policy. So the first priority in the district's reserve policy is to fill our operating reserves. The reserve policy states that we will have 180 days or 6 months of operating expenses in our reserves, in our replacement reserves. So that's the first priority. After that, second priority, once we've filled the operating reserves, the next priority is to fill the replacement reserves bucket. And as I've noted, the floor in the replacement reserves is 3 years of projected system replacement costs.
Who
This-
places that floor? Is that some in district or is that elsewhere? Who set the floor?
So we set the floor, and
You set
the
okay.
floor is set based on 3 years of our projected system. So we take our total assets
Okay.
and their future depreciation when we think we need to replace them, and we'll take 3 years in total, and that'll be our minimum that we want to have in our reserves based on our reserve policy.
Thank you.
So the ceiling is 10 years of projected water system replacement costs, or 8 years of projected sewer replacement costs. And sewer is less because sewage tends to be more aggressive. Sewer assets age faster and need to be depreciated more frequently. So that's the replacement reserve bucket. The third priority in the reserve policy is to fill the rate stabilization bucket. Rate stabilizations are when we go over the ceiling in the replacement reserves, any funds above the ceiling will be put in a rate stabilization fund, and that money is used to offset future rate increases that we may need. And also, so there's the rate stabilization bucket. I should bring the buckets up at the same time. It'd just be more exciting, I guess, better. But also worth noting is we do have a sort of a caveat in the reserve policy that when we go over the ceiling in the replacement fund, we will fund the other post-employment benefits trust. However, that trust has been fully funded for several years now, so there's no need to fund anything into the trust. So that's the district's reserves, reserve policy, revenue requirement, how we set rates. Next, we're going to look at how we incorporate those into the budget and determine whether they're appropriate for our financial plan. And we do that by looking at our reserve levels. These reserve levels are going to come from the fiscal year 2022 approved budget that you've seen before. So the floor in the reserves, as I mentioned, is 3 years of projected system replacement costs plus the operating reserve. So in 2021, that floor is projected to be $41 million. And as our assets age and need to be replaced, we need to replace more of them, and they cost more to replace with future inflation costs. That's projected to increase to $54 million by 2026. Next, we look at the ceiling. So the ceiling is 10 years of projected system replacement costs for water, 8 years for sewer, plus the operating reserves. Excuse me. In 2021, that amount's projected to be $108 million. And by 2026, it's projected to be $137 million. So that's our floor and our ceiling per our reserve policy based on our existing infrastructure. We have over $390 million of depreciating assets that we need to replace in our future, basically. And we look at a 5-year plan of replacing those assets, and we incorporate it in here, and we plan to replace them.
Just a quick question, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
The only way to fill those buckets is with rates? I mean, are we filling those buckets with debt, with anything else? Or just,
So if we were to go below the floor here, or if we thought there was a need in the future for replacement of existing infrastructure where rates couldn't cover and keep the reserves above the floor per our policy, then we would look at issuing debt for replacement of existing
so
infrastructure.
we could fill buckets with other than ratepayer money?
We could absolutely issue debt for the replacement fund.
Okay, that's what I confirm, okay.
We don't have any, and actually, debt is more expensive because you do have interest rates and other costs associated with debt. So it's usually better to just plan for the future, try to fund your reserves, get them up to a level where you can project out for the future so they're sufficient to cash fund it, so to speak.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you.
And actually, the next line showing our reserves will demonstrate that. So this is how we do our 5-year plan in the approved budget. And you can see that in 2021, our reserves were up around $101 million. They were at $101 million because we planned for the future and we knew we would have $92.8 million in replacement projects coming up in the next 5 years. So with that, when we get out to 2026, you can see that our replacement reserves get down to $78 million. That amount is still within policy limits, but much closer to the floor than it is to the ceiling, as you can see. That's how we do our financial plan, that's how we determine our rates, and that's how our reserves function. So that's the replacement reserves. I'm going to move on to the capacity reserves in my next section. Unless there are any questions on that, I can stop there or keep going.
Just a quick question. Could you describe how the reserve policy affects our credit rating for the debt issuance?
Yeah, so the credit rating agencies look at the amount of reserves you have. They look at several other factors, such as your management's resumes. They look at the operation of the district, the willingness of the board to raise rates. But they look at the level of reserves and see if you have sufficient reserves and a sufficient plan in place to fund future project costs. One of those, among those is the days in cash that you have, which is basically the operation expenses, the total reserves divided by operating expenses. So they look at your reserves and they say, yes, we have sufficient reserves. And during the debt issuance process, they looked at, we actually went through surveillances with Fitch and with Standard & Poor's. And both of them rated us AA+, and Fitch actually said with a positive outlook, which hopefully means we'll go to a AAA. I said that during both of the surveillances. I was hoping they'd fall for it, maybe just give it to us.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Director Boyd-Hodge.
On the last slide, can you just go back?
Sure.
The balances that you show here, the balances that you project out, what is the percentage increase that's based on of rates?
So in this is the 2022 budget. For this, I think we assumed around 4% increase in the revenue requirement per year. So that doesn't necessarily mean we'll have a 4% increase in rates, it's just in the revenue requirement. I know that seems vague, but we're assuming we'll need 4% more in revenue over the next 5 years, almost per year, something like that. And Mike, I don't know if you have exact.
And the rates were about anywhere from 3.5 to 4.5.
Yeah.
And that's carried through for the full project out?
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So moving on, next I want to go into the capacity fund. This might be the one that most people are interested in. Again, reporting requirements are based on the Mitigation Fee Act. It's kept separately and tracked separately, reported on separately, and never commingled with the replacement reserve. But looking at what's in the capacity fund, what are our capacity reserves? Well, they're funded by developers for growth. The rates or the capacity fees are established by the capacity fee study. Our last capacity fee study was completed July 9th, 2019. And it was approved on August 7th, 2019. That capacity fee study was prepared by Atkinson Keys Group, our consultants, and they based the capacity fee study on our water and sewer master plan, which was approved by the board on May 1st, 2019. And that capacity fee study resulted in a fee increase. I have rates here, it's the capacity fee rate, has nothing to do with water rates at all. These are just the capacity fees. So if I say rates coming up, I'm talking about capacity fee rates. So the capacity rates increased by 17.9% effective January 2nd, 2020, and that's in total. That includes both water and sewer. And our capacity fees are increased annually through the Construction Inflation Index, also referred to as the ENR or Engineering News Record.
And Wes, if I can, just to clarify that when we say fee increases, that was all on the development community, not on the ratepayers at all.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of flow through, that was the capacity reserves. The capacity fee timing, there's been a lot of questions about the timing of the capacity fees. What's the difference between collecting the capacity fees at inception versus occupancy? And does it hurt, is it detrimental to the district or the ratepayers? And we already know it's not detrimental to the ratepayers because it has nothing to do with our water rates. So that question's already answered, I think, but let's talk about the difference between the two. So timing of collection of capacity fees. I'm going to give a scenario, and in this scenario, we're assuming we would collect 100 sewer EDUs for a project. That project's going to take 2 years and be completed in January of year 3. And we'll also assume that the rate at the time is $9,720 per EDU, and that the ENR, which is the Construction Inflation Index, is 2.5%, and our IRR, which is our internal rate of return, is 2.5%. So for simplicity, I've assumed those two are equal, they're the same. Over the last 10 years or so, the ENR has been 2.5%, so that's sort of an actual average over the last 10 years. Our IRR has actually been a lot less, somewhere around 1.2%, but there isn't a significant difference between the two, so for simplicity's sake here, I'm going to keep them equal. So if we were to collect at inception from a developer, the developer would come in, and I'm showing the impact on the capacity fee fund down here at the bottom. If we were to collect at inception from a developer, they would have to pay for 100 EDUs at $9,720 dollars. So the total we would collect would be $972,000. We would put that money in our investments, and over the 2 years at our internal rate of return, we would earn $49,207. So that's how that would work at inception. Alternatively, if the developer came in and paid at occupancy, and it is current district policy to collect at occupancy, so if we're to collect at occupancy, over those 2 years, the capacity fee would have been increased by the Engineering News Record, the Construction Inflation Index, over the 2 years, and the fee would now be $10,212 at year 3 in January. So based on 100 EDUs, we would collect $1,021,000, and that would be exactly the same and have no effect on the district. So you can see inception versus occupancy, assuming the ENR and the IR are the same, there's no effect, it's not detrimental, it doesn't hurt the district at all, it really makes no difference. So then, moving on from there, this is going to be a sort of a second scenario, and this is based on like a real life scenario. We actually increased our sewer capacity fee in January of 2020 by 30.3%. So in this case, if the developer pays at inception, same thing, pays $9,720 for 100 EDUs, we collect $972,000, we invest it, we earn $49,207. If they pay at occupancy, they come in January to pay their fee. We've now raised the rates by the engineering news record over the 2 years, plus 30% that we just did for our cap fee study and raised the rates. So now they're paying $12,986 per EDU. For 100 EDUs, that's $1,298,000, and the district would actually collect $277,000 more than we would have collected at inception. So in this case, the district actually benefits from collecting at occupancy. So in effect, it's not detrimental to the district. It seems to only benefit the district to collect at occupancy based on these scenarios. And it's also worth mentioning, as I did before, our IR has been historically lower than the ENR, which means the cap fees are higher, and when we invest, we're earning less. So again, we're getting more money by collecting at occupancy versus inception. There's also been questions about, well, how much less debt would you have issued if you'd collect the developer fees at inception and had that money? Well, when we go through the debt issuance process, typically we look at projects that are coming up in the future. And we say, which projects do we want to finance through debt? Which ones are really expensive, and how are we going to finance them through debt? And we issue the debt to finance the cost of those projects. If we have $600,000 in the bank and we're looking at issuing $30 million in debt for the cost of $30 million in projects, we're not going to lower the debt issuance to $29,400,000. We're typically just going to go for the $30 million. It's not really going to make a difference in the amount of debt that we would issue. And again, I can't stress it enough. From a ratepayer perspective, it doesn't matter because it doesn't affect our water or sewer rates. This only affects the capacity fund and the developer fees. So that's the capacity fee timing.
Yeah, Wes, before you move on, so Wes looked at it from a rigorous numbers perspective. I would look at it from a fairness perspective as well. So we typically, you don't want to charge a customer until they actually place a demand on the system, right? So when a developer comes in, if it takes, in Wes's example, it takes them 2 years to develop their project. If you collected money from them 2 years in advance, that's a benefit. They're being hit with a fee before they realize the benefit. Similarly, for our ratepayers, we don't charge them in advance. We don't charge you 2 years in advance for what we think you're going to use for water 2 years in the future. So we see the development industry is similar to our ratepayers. They're both customers, and we need to treat them fairly. And when the demands are placed on our system, that's the time that we feel is appropriate to place the charges on the development community.
That makes sense.
So next I want to go through some scenarios of how our capacity fee model and the collection of the capacity fee functions and sort of the flow of it. So in this scenario, first we're going to assume that we're planning to construct an $8 million facility to expand our system. So this is a capacity project. To construct this facility, we're planning to issue debt in the amount of $8 million, the cost of the project, at 4.5% for 20 years. Issuing debt, as we all know now, based on the last year, is about a 6-month-long process. I said it before, it's pretty accurate. So it takes a while to issue debt. You have to do some planning and know the cost of the project that you're financing as you go through that process. And our debt service payment in this case would be $610,000 a year. And we're going to assume that we're going to collect 894 EDUs over 20 years, or 47 EDUs per year, at the sewer rate of $12,986 per EDU. So that'll equate to $610,000. So looking at this scenario, and this is just the flow of it first, we would issue $8 million in debt, we would pay $8 million in construction costs, then we would pay $600,000 in debt service costs, and at the end, because we collect at occupancy, we would hopefully collect the capacity fee revenue. And I say hopefully, and I'll answer that question, why I said hopefully in just a minute. So the cash flow in that, we have $8 million in debt proceeds. We spend those proceeds on constructing the asset. And then we have to pay for our debt service costs of $600,000, so now we're $600,000 in the hole. but then we collect the capacity fee revenue of $600,000 and it's back to zero. That's the ideal scenario. That's how the capacity fee model is set to function. It should be a zero-sum game. The proceeds that come in cover the costs. In the next scenario, we're going to assume that the actual project costs were $13 million. And we've seen this before where we've had change orders to projects. We've had Encina projects where they thought it was going to cost a certain amount and then told us later it was going to cost a different amount. The cost of projects can change for several different reasons. Plus, you're looking at issuing debt 6 months before, so the cost can change during that process too. So let's assume in this scenario that the actual project cost was $13 million. That means you're issuing $8 million in debt because that's what you thought it was going to cost, but you're going to spend $13 million, and then you're going to pay the $600,000 in debt service, and you're going to collect the $600,000 in capacity fee revenue. The cash flow on that, $8 million in debt proceeds, spend $13 million, now you're $5 million in the hole at a deficit. And then you spend $600,000 in debt service costs, and now you're $5.6 million in deficit situation. And then you collect the $600,000 in cap fees, so now you're negative $5 million, which is basically the shortfall on the cost of the project. So that's one of the ways that we can, estimating costs of projects that the capacity fee model could end up in a shortfall or deficit situation. Another scenario, let's assume we're saying, and this is where I said hopefully we collect the 47 EDUs per year. Let's say development slowed and we only collect 23 EDUs. What happens then? Well, we have $8 million in debt, $8 million in construction costs. We still have to pay our debt service costs of $610,000, but we only collect $300,000 in capacity fee revenue. So the cash flows on that, $8 million in debt proceeds. We spend $8 million to construct the asset. We have to pay our debt service costs of $600,000, so we're $600,000 in the hole. And then we collect $300,000 in cap fees, so we're at negative $300,000. Again, we're in a deficit or shortfall situation in the capacity fund. So these are 3 different scenarios of how it flows and what can happen to get you in a shortfall situation. Next, I'm going to go into our capacity reserves history. And this is this is what I call our dark times. That's why the slide is dark. We were in dark times prior to this. We're moving into lighter times now. You'll see the transition in the slide colors, hopefully. But historically, and I jest, but in all seriousness, this is what the numbers tell us. And I think we've mentioned already, most of the current staff, management, and GM were not here during the majority of this period. So I'm showing you what the numbers tell us and what happened, and I'll be making some assumptions along the way. So in 2007, that was the last time the sewer capacity fund was at a positive balance, and it was at a $6.6 million positive balance. But then in 2008, we had $11.8 million in growth projects. Of those growth projects, 8.1 were for the Encina Phase 5 expansion. So in response to the cost of that project, we issued debt. We issued debt because we must have, and again, I don't know, I'm assuming we must have thought the cost of the project would be $8 million, so we issued $8 million in debt. So you can see, spending that issued debt, we're now in a deficit situation. The next year, we spent another $4.5 million on the same Encina Phase 5 expansion project. And the following year, another $700,000. So in total, Encina Phase 5 expansion cost us $13.3 million, and we have a debt issuance shortfall of $5.3 million. So that's how the sewer capacity fund got into a deficit situation back in 2008. From there, just moving along in history, in 2010, we had an additional $2.3 million in growth projects to total $3 million. And then we didn't issue debt again until 2013. And in 2013, we issued $7.1 million in debt. Why that amount, I'm not sure, but it wasn't enough to bring us out of a deficit situation. And then moving forward, we had another $8.6 million in growth projects to bring us to the shortfall or deficit situation of $6.2 million in 2016. So that's the sewer story. Now I'll go into the water story. And it's a similar story, but in 2007, we had $13.6 million in the water capacity fund, positive balance. At that time, we just completed the Twin Oaks Reservoir number 2, and we had financed that with debt, so we had $16 million in debt in that fund. But from then forward, we had $13.5 million in growth projects, and we had 0 debt issuances. So, but that's not, And saying that, I don't want you to think that debt issuance is the answer. Because in this case, we can actually see, and going back in time and looking through this, our capacity fees collected during this time were $9.8 million. Our debt service costs were $20.1 million. So if we issued debt, we would have just increased the cost of our debt service. So we wouldn't have been collecting enough capacity fees. We would have more debt service costs. It would have made the situation possibly worse at the time. So two things were causing this problem based on my opinion. We should have gone back and looked at it and looked at our cap fee model and said, are our cap fees sufficient for what we need for future growth and for the current situation? So that's what should have been done during this time period first. And then second, after we had certainty that our cap fees were appropriate, then looked at the possibility of issuing debt if the timing was right and if it fit our needs. So that's the history.
Now, are you referring to like the 2008, 2010 timeframe when you say that we should have looked at our cap fees?
So I'm referring to, we had 9 years of time frame here where you're seeing a downward slope, where we should have at some point possibly said, hey, let's take a look at our cap fee model and see if our cap fees are sufficient.
Okay. And for the majority of those 9 years, I'm just trying to think, what year did you get here, Jim? 10.
2010.
Okay. I came on in 14 and, was 16?
The end of 2014.
And then 20 or 18 or 18-ish. So, who was, and none of, I don't think any of you were, maybe, no, it's not out there. But, so who in the audience was here in 2010? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Jim, you were brand new.
Right.
Brand spanking new, but,
And you recall that that's when we were in the recession,
yeah.
during that whole period from 2008 to
Yeah.
12. So contemplating raising capacity fees when nobody was building and we're all on our knees trying to make our water payment was just not in the cards.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And that's another thing we don't know. It was, I
Yeah.
assume it was a difficult situation. I'm sure we had competent people working for the district, so the reasoning for it, I'm sure there was reasoning for it. This is just the story, and I'm happy to present that we actually now have a capacity shortfall action plan to make these times brighter and to move forward in the future. And
Absolutely.
we are working with that action plan, and I get to present on that next. But before I do, I want to sort of define what the capacity fund deficit is. How can it happen? How can you go into a negative balance in your capacity fund? So we understand that the district's reserves are unrestricted reserves. They have to be expended on certain things, but they can be used for other things. They're not restricted by use. So those funds were used as an internal loan from the replacement reserve to the capacity reserve. So we always tracked the replacement reserve balance. It never changed. No money ever moved from the replacement reserves to the capacity reserve. So we always knew if the replacement reserves had $12 million, they had $12 million. If the capacity fund spent $8 million, they were negative $8 million. That's how the negative balance comes to be. This is an internal, what our consultants referred to as a paper loan in the capacity fee study, from the replacement reserves to the capacity. It's not an actual loan, it's not an official loan, it doesn't require promissory notes or board approval. It's a use of unrestricted funds. It's not a gift of money between funds. We never transferred the funds. It's also not considered in the revenue requirement. So as I mentioned, this is for the capacity fund only. The revenue requirement is established from operating expenses, replacement of existing infrastructure. The deficit is never considered in that, is not considered in setting rates. And the capacity fund always paid interest to the replacement fund at the current rate at the time, so it always made the replacement fund whole. It was never hurt, and it was always tracked at its actual balance. And finally, as we know now, it no longer exists. We no longer have a deficit situation. It's now been eliminated with the issuance of $28 million in debt in August of 2021. Kind of gave away the punchline there, but I'll bring it up 3 more times for excitement. So next, our capacity shortfall action plan. As I mentioned, we developed this plan. We identified an issue where we saw the deficit growing, and we said, what can we do about it? And the first part of our action plan was to finalize the cap fee study, to evaluate our capacity fees and see if they were appropriate. We did that. When we did that, it resulted in fee increases of 17.9%, which were increased on January 2nd, 2020. After that, we've incorporated it into our fiscal year 2022 budget, so it's in our 5-year plan with the capacity fee increases, so we can appropriately track that amount as well as our capital expenditures. And that's the next part. We plan to issue debt as outlined in the budget. When we see large capacity projects coming up in our 5-year and our 10-year plan, we plan to issue debt. It's built into the budget, and that's why you'll see in one of my examples coming up, 2025, we plan to issue $20 million in debt to fund projects. And that will be revisited, obviously, years from now. We're not going to do it now, but at that time, if it's appropriate, we will consider issuing that debt. And finally, again, part of our capacity shortfall action plan, we eliminated the deficit through the issuance of debt. Told you I'd say that a few more times. So the next story here, and you'll see times are getting brighter. These are our capacity reserve balances, and this is from our 2022 approved budget. And you can see from 2017 through 2021, we were in a deficit or shortfall situation. In 2021, we had projected growth projects of $5.7 million. In 2022, as part of our plan, we plan to issue $28 million in debt to cover the cost of the deficit as well as growth project costs, and we did that. So that's done. That's what the check is for. And then moving forward, so then I did want to mention before we move forward, that debt, the $28 million in debt, and this is something that the board, district staff, everyone should be very proud of, was issued at a true interest cost of 2.24%. That's got to be a record low. I'm sure someone out there has cheaper debt than that, but 2.24% over 30 years. That's pretty impressive.
And wasn't that a function of our rating?
Yeah, it was one of the functions of our rating, so
Very
we have AA plus rating.
Yes.
And we have sufficient, well, part of the rating is that there are sufficient reserves in our prudent financial planning and all the other excellent things the district has done, so we got that rate.
And just to be clear, this isn't the district's debt technically. This debt will be paid off by developers and developers only.
Correct.
So it's their debt.
Correct.
It's developers' debt.
It is funded in the capacity fund. The debt service costs are paid for by developers. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that $14.9 million of that debt issuance, the proceeds were for prior capital expenditures. So we got an immediate cash infusion into the capacity fund, and that's why we are now no longer at a deficit balance, because we were able to fund 3 years of prior capital expenditures. We went through that in the several debt issuance presentations that we had with our financial consultants and our bond counsel, which projects we could finance with this debt issuance, and that's the amount that was determined to be prior capital expenditures. So now moving forward, in our budget, we have $6.4 million of projected growth costs coming up by 2024. And after that, we have $19 million in growth projects by 2026. In order to address that, we have a plan to issue $20 million in 2025. And again, that's in there as a budgeted plan. We'll revisit it in 2025, and if we need to issue debt, we will. So in total, our total growth projects over the next 5 years will be $25.4 million, and we plan to consider issuing $20 million in debt. The reason why the issuance of debt is a little lower is because some of that will come from the $28 million debt issuance that we just had. Next, I should have made this slide light as well, but it does have a dark component to it. In 2016, you can see that, and these are actually our capacity fees historically from 2016 as they compare to our debt service costs. So in 2016, we actually collected less in capacity fees, and again, I mentioned historically it was like $9.8 million to the $20 million in total debt service costs. In 2016, the capacity fees were less than the debt service costs, but then in 2017, you can see that the capacity fees actually exceeded debt service costs, so we were able to at least fund our debt service costs, and things kind of get brighter from there. Over the next 5 years, we collected $36.2 million in capacity fees, and our debt service costs were $27.3 million. And this only partially reflects the increase of the 17.9% capacity fee increase in 2020. 2021, we collected $7.7 million in capacity fees, and our debt service cost was $5.4 million.
Wes, is the dip in 2020 due to the pandemic?
It could be. I actually don't know the answer to that. I would assume that development would have slowed down and that we would have collected less
Probably
capacity.
contributed to it.
Yeah. So then moving on, in summary, probably all happy to get to the summary. Our capacity fund is not considered in setting sewer rates. I think we covered that several times tonight and in several other presentations. The deficit in the capacity fund does not affect sewer rates. Sewer rates are established through our operating expenses, replacement of existing infrastructure. That determines the revenue requirements that's used to set rate. It's tracked separately. It's completely separate from the capacity. And for that reason, we've had consultants look at our rates, and then we established the rate study, and we are Prop 218 compliance.
You said sewer rates. Did you mean sewer and water?
Water and sewer, yes. Sorry.
Thank you.
And the capacity fund, it is tracked and reported separately, and for that reason, and those funds are, per the Mitigation Fee Act, we're required to record revenues and expenditures in that fund in a separate fund by itself and never commingle it with our other funds. And we do that, and for that reason, it is in compliance with the Mitigation Fee Act. And finally, I'll go through it again, our shortfall action plan. It's exciting, so I got to do it again, but now I get to add some animation. So our deficit has been eliminated. We've been following our action plan, and we've officially eliminated the debt. We're no longer in a deficit situation. That doesn't mean that we'll never be in a deficit situation again. You've seen the scenarios where it could result and how it could result, but currently we are not in a deficit situation. And that's been the result of our progress in our shortfall action plan. And we've improved our capacity fee calculation through the capacity fee study. We've improved it. We've raised the capacity fees. And finally, we've improved our debt issuance plan. Hopefully by looking at history and seeing the amount of debt issued for project costs, we'll get better at estimating the cost of projects and issuing the appropriate amount of debt. I know we've got engineers here who are excellent at estimating the cost of projects. So we've improved our debt issuance plan, and we plan to follow that going forward. So finally, in conclusion, to answer the question that we answered in the October 7th presentation on capacity fees, it's the same answer. It always will be the same answer. Are ratepayers funding development? The answer is no. Growth pays for growth. And with that, I say thank you, and I'll pass it on to General Manager Pruitt for some closing comments before we take questions.
All right, thank you, Wes, and thank you, James. I don't want to repeat everything they said. I think they did an awesome job.
Yes, they did.
We've done a lot of work. We're going to be doing a lot of work. So we're not done, but we're moving forward. I do want to say just a few things, though. One is our reserve levels are healthy. It positions us well for the future because we know we have a heavy capital program campaign ahead of us, and we want to make sure that we're not forced, and that's on the replacement side, the ratepayers will be paying. We want to make sure we're not forced into issuing debt to pay for some of those upcoming capital projects, because that will cost our ratepayers more in the long run. So it's good to have healthy reserves. Our water rates are in the lowest quartile in the whole county. And that's in spite of our water supply costs being, the blended water supply cost being the highest in the county because of our desal purchase. 25% of our water purchases are desal, and that desal water is almost twice as expensive as other water supplies. So for us to have our rates be at the lowest quartile and have that water supply cost, it's pretty impressive. And every action we've taken and that we will be asking the board to take will be looked at and vetted by VWD staff, our attorneys, our rate consultants, bond counsel, bond underwriters, and our financial analysts. And none of them have questioned our practices. So I'm pretty confident that we're doing things right. And the preeminent rating agencies, and Wes mentioned them, Fitch and Standard & Poor's, they've reviewed all of our actions and they've reaffirmed our AA+. And rating agencies don't do that if they think you're not doing things correct in the financial field. So, but we'll look at all those things again as we take these these future actions, and all of them will be in full compliance with the law. I mean, we want to make sure that we're treating our ratepayers and the development community fairly, and there's no cross-subsidization. There hasn't been in the past. There won't be in the future. We're happy to answer any questions the board may have, but I know you probably want to turn it over to the public. But before I give it back to you, President Elletharp, I do want to thank staff. They put in a tremendous amount of work. Wes and James in particular. Mike's helped out a ton. We've spent hundreds of hours, and not just for tonight's meeting, but in these 15 meetings that I referenced early, hundreds of hours, tens of thousands of dollars to come up with these numbers. So it's at a significant impact to staff, and not just cost, but resource allocation. So we hope we've answered the questions for the board members and for the public, but we'll see what the public has to say with that.
Okay.
So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions from the board before we take public comment?
One question.
Sure.
Echo what General Manager Perrone and the amount of hours in the presentation. Thank you, James and Wes. A quick question on the 30%. You said there was a 30% increase, which seemed substantial.
Yes.
So I'm not a developer, but if I were a developer and I wanted to build homes in San Marcos or the surrounding area, is that in line with Vista, Carlsbad, Oceanside? I mean, is that going to deter developers from building here? I mean, what caused that 30% increase and why, and is it in line?
Yeah, and that's going to be more of a question for James on that one as far as the deterring development.
All right, James, there you go.
So if you look at our CIP and the growth-related project, it's very sewer heavy. As a matter of fact, just one project that I mentioned in my presentation, the land outfall, which is our sewer that takes water from the San Marcos region all the way down to the coast, to the Encina, the treatment plant over there. That's tens and tens of millions of dollars just by itself. So we're very sewer intensive in our future projects, which puts that capital number at the top of that equation much bigger on the sewer side. That's the main driver for the sewer increase, which was the majority of that increase, or really, if you're talking to 30%, that was sewer, right? Yeah, that was sewer only, so that's the reason why.
Oh, that is
So there's a
sewer only.
nexus, yep. The water didn't increase nearly as much, it was really the sewer that increased tremendously.
And I would say we are on the high side as far as
Okay,
a
that's what I was
sewer
thinking.
capital facility fee when you compare with our neighbors. We're not the highest, but we're on the higher end, and we considered that. And we did hear a lot of comments from the development community thinking those were too high. We just look at it from a math perspective. We do the hard work, we calculate what they should be, and that's the fee that we propose. And yes, we have met with developers, just like we meet with ratepayers too. So we listen to both of our customers when we propose a change in rates or fees, and we consider that feedback.
Have any pulled out because of the fee increase?
I'm sure there's some that have either delayed or deferred their project. They don't come in and tell us, I'm done. They always say, well, if you do that, we'll stop developing, but then they
But
come back.
nobody, okay.
We had a couple of contentious meetings with a room full of developers, so.
Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent job, both of you. Thank you.
So, and I did want to, sorry to interrupt, I kind of jumped on you there. I did want to mention that all of those meetings, as General Manager Perrone mentioned, we have links and times to all of them. We're actually developing a web page as a resource to our ratepayers. So they can go and look at all of our previous presentations, see both of the capacity fund presentations as well as the discussions with the BIA and developers. And when we talked about increasing the capacity fees, all of those meetings will be available. Hopefully, I don't know what the timeline is on developing, there's quite a few of them, but we're trying to put together a web page as a resource.
Yeah, and that webpage will have not just the PowerPoint presentations, but the video too. So anybody can go back as far back in history as they want and watch all these meetings.
Thank you.
Director Penny, could you pass that speaker slip there? Thank you very much. All right, so I have 5 speaker slips, and I'll call them out in the order that I received them. So the first is Melissa Magallanes.
I'm just testing it. Yeah, everybody can hear me? Okay.
You could bring that towards you if it's easier.
Okay. I recently had a conversation on Facebook concerning subsidizing development. And the person that was on there, I don't know who it was that answered me, stated, and you can look at it right on Facebook, all funds used to cover the developer fund shortfall have been repaid. All funds. There's a meaning to that. So what are these all funds? And it's been repaid with interest. That tells me there's a loan somewhere. So what are those funds, and why is it being repaid in interest unless there's some type of loan capacity there? Which, so with that, I'm trying to understand why Vallecitos and Carlsbad are the only ones that do not have a buy-in. I have a list of everybody here, all the cities, and there are hybrids, and there are also some, we have an incremental, and so does Carlsbad. Now, I did hear what I heard about, why we have an incremental as far as development. So are you telling me that none of these cities are in our position where they can actually require a hybrid or a buy-in. And also going back to those funds that are being used to cover, these developers, it's coming from somewhere. So that tells me, not one penny from us, but I don't know if there's just some type of funding that's there that pays it. Where is this money coming from? So from what I understand, in 2013, there was some type of accommodations made for developers. And I would like to know what accommodations those were, what that entails. And the reason why I want to know that, because, not taking a snapshot, but taking several years from 2012 to 2020, developers' deficit has actually increased 159%. So there is a deficit, and this is all public, this is all you could find this, it's all public information. So there's a deficit. So if there's a deficit, we're being told here, not one penny, but there's a deficit. But yet our rate pay from the same time period has gone up 268%. So my main concern is this deficit there, between this time period. So if they're paying 100% in the development fee, then for the developers, then how come the numbers are not showing that? And how can we expect this 28 million to be paid by developers if they're already in a deficit by, again, negative 159% from those time periods, while ratepayers have gone up quite a bit? Thank you.
I'll take a shot, and I'll
Okay.
rely on these guys too. So the original, what funds, so the funds that were repaid was the deficit, right? Wes talked about the paper loan. The issuance of the $28 million in debt allowed us to repay that, so there is no more paper loan, there is no more deficit. If you look at our books and you look at the capacity funds for both water and wastewater, they're positive, they're not negative. Negative would indicate a deficit, so the deficit is gone.
And that was effective what date?
August of '21, we issued the debt, but it took a while. Some of the projects we could reimburse instantaneously because they were previously constructed. Some are currently being constructed, and we can't actually transfer the money over until the costs are incurred for the future project. The speaker mentioned the loan repayment. That's what, that loan, when it got paid, when we issued the debt and paid back the replacement fund for the paper loan, that debt is now being placed on the developer, and it is calculated into the capital facility fee. So every time a developer comes in and pays a cap fee, a portion of their cap fee goes to repay that debt for that $28 million of loan. The buy-in component, we do a modified hybrid. As we do the next master plan, capital facility fee study, and calculate our fee, we will be looking at buy-in. As we progress from a growing agency to more of a maintenance type of agency, we will transition to a buy-in. Staff doesn't think we're quite there yet, but we will consider it with the use of our rate consultant when we do the capital facility fee, and James gave the timeline to that. I don't know exactly which accommodations the speaker is referring to back in 2013, so it's hard to, I don't want to guess what she may be referring to, so if she has, or the other speakers have more specific information, we'd be happy to answer it then. And the 159%, I don't know what that reference is to. All I can say is there is no developer deficit anymore. So, and I'll look to Wes or James if they want to add to that.
General Manager Prum pretty much covered it all. And I think we covered all of those questions during the presentation, both James and I, the buying component, as well as the paper loan or the funds that were used. And again, it doesn't exist anymore. It was a use of internal unrestricted funds to pay, but we tracked the replacement fund separately the whole time. The balance was always accurate, capacity fund as well. So there is no more deficit, there is no more loan. It's not an issue currently. And the 2013 accommodations, I'm not really sure why that, if it did exist, why it would matter, because as we saw, the deficit began in 2008. And from there, it just got worse. So I'm not really sure why 2013 is an important date.
And
How do we simplify it though? Because it's confusing and complex, right? I can see, we've been hearing for over 2 years now, basically the same presentation that you just made. And, we don't do this 40 hours a week, but we're much more involved than the average citizen. And there's obviously a disconnect, right? And I'm glad that we have company tonight, but I want them to leave here with a comfort level and a better understanding of how this works. And I'm trying, and that's why I came up with my hypothetical scenario earlier. I'm trying to simplify it, right? Because it's a lot of, nexus and all these weird buzzwords, right? That the average person don't really use in their everyday vocabulary, right? And so and paper loans, for example. Can you tell us more about that? I think the speaker asked it's a common sense question, right? If there's a deficit, then where was that money? Where did it come from?
yeah, so I'll touch on it and then Wes can add to that. So, and I forgot to mention it in my first response. So the paper loan, I think it was around $17 million that came from the replacement fund. It was never transferred, but it's money that couldn't have been invested in the market, right? So the reason when it was being repaid, every month, we were calculating what interest that money, that paper loan deficit, could have been making on the market. And I think Wes referred to that. So every month, we were transferring over money from the capacity fund to the replacement fund. We were increasing the deficit to cover the interest payments they had to make use of that money. So although the money didn't trade hands, it's as if the replacement fund gave money to the capacity fund, never did happen, and then they couldn't take that, the replacement couldn't invest that money. So we tracked it and said, well, you would have otherwise made this much money in interest, so we're gonna credit the replacement fund that much interest, and we'll pay you back the principal so that there's no paper loan outstanding. Don't walk away thinking money ever transferred across from replacement to capacity. I just say that as a way to think about it, because you're right, these are technical things. And I had a conversation with Wes today. Walk me through, how did the dollars actually move around?
Does that help?
I have,
Well, for me, it's, I'm hearing two different things. Because, I mean, if you would like the stats, where I got my stats, I can get them to you for the negative 159% jump in the deficit for the developers. I can get that to you. And this goes up to 2020. You say as of today, we do not have a deficit. So are you saying that whole amount was paid between 2020 and 2022?
Yeah, we issued $28 million of debt in August of 2021, which got rid of the entire deficit.
Well, you just said that the $28 million was going to be paid by developers.
They will pay back. So when you take a loan, it's like a home loan. When you get money to buy a house, you get money and then you have to pay monthly your mortgage to pay it back. The developers are the same thing. This $28 million came across, but it has to be paid back on an annual basis. That payback is coming from the developers, not the ratepayers.
Okay, so how come there was no discussion that there was this deficit up until 2020 if you just stated from 2020 to 2022?
Oh, no,
it got paid off?
yeah, there's been conversations about the deficit ever since I've been here, guys.
So, I mean, none of that was mentioned. I mean, that's not a snapshot.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that. We've talked
Okay, so
about
that,
that.
and I'm just saying, you just said that. So was that money just hanging out here? Or was somehow that whatever needed to be paid got paid somehow? Or was it hanging out this whole time?
if I understand it, there are actually three funds. There's the unrestricted, or the restricted funds for water. There's the restricted funds for capacity, and then the unrestricted funds. Is that correct?
I'll let Wes address the restricted versus unrestricted fund.
No, our funds would be restricted through board action. Board would have to say these funds are restricted for specific purposes. None of our funds collected are really restricted unless, the only restricted funds we have is if we had a debt service payment coming up and we moved it to a trust, and then it would be classified as restricted on our books. The restrictions on the funds come from regulations, and for example, the Mitigation Fee Act says the developer fees can be expended on only what they were collected for. While we have them, we can use them internally for whatever we need to, as long as we don't expend them. The example I gave to General Manager Prum today, and hopefully this makes sense, but Director Sinella, let's say you had $12 million, and you've got $12 million in cash in the bank, and I need $8 million. So I say, will you lend me $8 million? And of course, you know I'm good for it, so you're gonna lend me $8 million. You lend me $8 million, you now have a receivable on your books for $8 million, which is an asset. You're saying I have $8 million as an asset, I have $4 million in cash, I'm still worth $12 million. That's how we track our internal funds. We knew the replacement reserve still had that $12 million. We never transferred the funds. In this scenario, you did transfer it to me, but in our record keeping, we don't transfer it. We say replacement has 12 million, capacity spent 8 million, they're negative 8 million. Those two balances are tracked that way.
So so paper loan is probably not even the best way to describe it. It's more of a bookkeeping thing.
Correct. It was the consultant's terminology to say paper loan, to describe it as an unofficial internal loan. That just happened to be the terminology used.
But no money was ever loaned.
No,
Okay, so paper loan is very confusing.
right.
Yeah, okay. I kind of better understand it now from an accounting standpoint and a bookkeeping standpoint.
Did anybody address about the fee increase she was talking about? You know, you haven't responded to that, right?
So I think there,
Which fee increase?
I think she's referring to the fact that the rate increase has been, I think she said 47%. I'm not sure the timeframe.
268%.
2012 to 2020.
So you can't compare water rate or sewer rate increases to construction increases, and it sounds like she's comparing a decrease in or an increase in our deficit, not even really the rates, to our water rate increases. They're completely different animals, they're completely different things. The water rates are based on our operating expenses, our cost of replacing existing infrastructure. So using that and say our water purchases went up over, what's the time frame? Is it, I think it's 10 years? 10 years, over 10 years, if the Water Authority raised their rates, pretty much whatever they raise their rates by or similar, we have to raise our rates for operating expenses and replacement of existing infrastructure. And it has nothing to do with the capacity fund or the capacity fund deficit. Hopefully we've made that clear during the presentation.
So, can I have to do a follow-up question? And Mike, I know you're probably the smartest person in the room on this, but just doing kind of just simple math, and if I got this wrong, let me know. 268 divided by 10 years would be an average of 26.8% per year. I haven't been here, I've only been here since 2014, but I don't think we've ever had a rate increase more than 3 or 4% and in any given year, and some years we've had zero, such as last year.
So luckily I have a Mike Arthur.
Okay, and he's back there doing this, so.
he dropped a note on my desk for me to read.
Okay.
And that the note says from 2012 to 2022, our average single-family resident increase has been 3.91% per year.
Okay.
So
So even if there's some compounding there, right, 3.9 on top of 3.9 on top of, I mean, there's a little bit of compounding, just like our 401ks and our retirement savings.
So I can tell you what that compounding is. Over that 10-year period, that was a 46.72% increase over a 10-year period.
Total.
Total. Yeah.
And Glenn and Mike agree, so it must be true.
So 46-ish, you said, or what was it?
46.72.
Engineers agreeing with.
And then if you
finance.
divided that by 10,
Crazy.
that's more in line with the 4%, so.
Yes.
So I mean, I'm
I can
open to hearing,
Actually, I think what,
Referring to the increase in the replacement reserves from in a 10-year, the replacement reserve balance increased.
Oh, that's very different.
that's completely,
whole different thing.
that's completely different, yeah.
yeah, that's exactly, I think she's
And
comparing
at the
the,
same time, the the deficit spiraled from 3.2 million to 8.2 million in that time frame. So you're referring to the.
So not rates, not rates, thank you for clarifying. Okay, and I think you kind of covered the reserve policy, but do you think that there's any more clarification?
Well, I think I covered our reserves and what they look like. We got up to $101 million because we plan on having $92.8 million in replacement projects over the next 5 years. That's why the reserve levels are what they are, and it's to fund the replacement of existing infrastructure.
I hope that makes sense. So the district has to be forward-looking and plan for the future, and we're looking 5-10 years out, and so we start raising funds through our rates, a portion of what everybody here pays in their water bill, to anticipate that we're gonna have to put this outfall, for example, in the future, that might actually be capacity, that's probably a bad example. We might have a water main break or something, which happens occasionally within our utility. And so we're planning for that ahead of time, so when it does happen, we can fund the repairs in a quick manner, versus having to go out and try to obtain the funding at that time, which would take time to do. We wouldn't be able to make the repairs, and it'd be a detriment to service and human health for that matter.
Yeah, every year, in conjunction with the development of the budget, we give that 5-year projection on where the reserves will be, an explanation of why they are, and, how we think they'll decrease with the anticipated future expenditures.
And if I could add, we've got several meetings coming up, which will go into great detail on our capital improvement plan. I think it's May 11th, May 19th, and June 2nd. We'll be going through the budget, our capital improvement plan in detail by project, the replacement costs, the capacity projects. It's all going to be there and presented to all of you for full transparency, as always.
Yeah, it's actually May 10th, May 19th, and June 1st will be the next 3 budget discussions.
Yeah, so we're right in the middle of budget season, and we get very little public, so I would encourage anybody that has any interest in the budget process to come and listen to our story. Okay, let's hear from Fran Greases.
Yay, Fran. Hey, good seeing you again.
Always good to be seen.
That's the alternative.
Better be seen than viewed.
For sure. A new developer, Mike made the little example, housing project, 10 houses. Who is buying the infrastructure? Who is buying the giant pipes we see being laid in the ground? The mains that go up to the houses? I assume a regular plumber does the inside of the house, but who's doing the other work?
Absolutely. So the developer is paying 100%. So they hire the contractor. They go into a construction agreement that this board approves that says the developer is going to fully fund it, reimburse us for any of our direct costs, which is really inspections and doing quality control and
So
quality
you're not
assurance.
buying any of the infrastructure?
Yeah, when you look at the development, the district and its ratepayers pay $0 for that infrastructure, and even none of that even comes out of our capacity funds. It comes if any direct impact. So in other words, you can't build a house unless you can bring water to it, and you can take sewer from it for most of the development in San Marcos. So they have to build the minimum requirement and meet our standards, that design standard that I mentioned in my pinwheel, that meets that standard to bring water to their homes, which includes fire protection, drinking water, safety, all that stuff, and also take sewer away from them. So they're 100% responsible for it, and there's $0 coming from any ratepayer money. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. Why would there be? There's zero, there's no other deals. The only time that you ever see anything is, let's say in our master plan, we need a 16-inch pipe, a big pipe, and the developer only needs an 8-inch pipe, a smaller pipe to meet his needs. And we don't want to rip up the road twice. Then we go into a different type of agreement. And that money comes from developers also.
I got a question, James. I am so familiar with master plans, it makes my head spin. Okay, I worked for AT&T for 26 years, and what you do for the water company, I did for countries. Developing countries who wanted to install telephone. Moral of the story is, why don't you guys, I don't know what your mitigation act refers to, but why do you not have a commercial and a residential side of the business? So there is no intermingling of funds. Because common sense tells me, you call it a paper loan, the money's moving. It's going to someone's hands. And it does smell as though you're collecting money from somewhere and you're using the money to do something. And now that you've cleaned up your books, apparently, and have no debt, you're still getting debt. For what?
So,
Well, no, if you're,
Not deficit.
yeah.
They have debt, but not.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've got debt. So, I mean, if I had debt, I obviously overspent. So I have to figure out a way to pay my debt. So I don't understand how you can say developers pay for development, because I think common sense tells me, when I worked for AT&T, we didn't put in a friggin' telephone pole unless that country was paying for it. But the big difference between, I think, what we were doing and what you do is we had this little thing called reoccurring revenue, because we knew once those telephone poles and those lines were up, those phones were going to start calling, and we could start collecting on that. So there's got to be something I'm missing here in how your projects work, because it seems to me if the developer pays for it, the developer lugs all the stuff in, digs the holes, puts all the stuff in, you guys come and inspect, then the guy's ready to start selling the houses. And what happens when he builds 200 houses and only 180 sell? If you're waiting for occupancy to get your money, is there not a timeline on these contracts as to when whatever you lent him is due and payable?
So to answer your question, there is no loan to the developer, right? So, and that did happen during the recession, right? So the developers put in their infrastructure, which they paid for. The district put in infrastructure, like our big 40 million gallon tank, or back in 2005 to 2008, a big treatment plant expansion, and then we hit a recession. So we didn't cover our debt service at that time for those loans. And then Wes kind of went over what that looked like in that graph, the dark times, and what it looks like in the light times. So that is exactly what happened. That's exactly how it lays out. Now, I don't know about AT&T, but I work with SCG&E all the time, and they have a similar process to us through the CPUC, and they have their master plan. I actually have a really good friend that's fairly high up in there that works on their planning documents and their planning studies. And now they have a profit-driven margin, which is a lot different, and we're a government nonprofit agency. So they have different revenue sources they could count on. We have other regulations within the laws that kind of lock us in. At the end of the day, the developer's paying for that larger infrastructure. So if you look at all those little pipes, like where I grade everything out, there's no reason for anybody in the district or district to fund any of that. That's what the developer needed for their project. They paid 100% for it. Those bigger regional projects are really what's in our master plan. If you go through our master plan and you look at it, it's upsizing a line, making it bigger, digging up San Marcos Boulevard and putting a big pipe in it. I know you guys don't want to hear that, but it's going to happen sooner or later. And it'll be traffic nightmare. But, those are those bigger projects. And we can't build half of a pipe or half of a tank. So we take out a loan and we build the whole thing. And then the loan proceeds are paid over, is it 20, 25 years, Wes? Yeah. So over a period of time.
So you are paying for development?
So, and the developer pays for that.
Yeah, but when?
When they come in and they pay their capacity fees. And Wes showed the chart, which shows how that works, how we cover our debt service.
Why don't you get that money in stages? 20% of the project done, 30% of the project done?
We get 100% when they take occupancy.
Oh, but why wouldn't you collect along the way? Because you're incurring debt along the way to make it happen. They should be kicking in something.
So these are also legal requirements though too. The way that our capacity fee model works, and we've got to remember it's a zero-sum game, we're not for profit. So what the developers are paying for is an expansion of our system to provide services to them. We have to build that system first, and to do that, we issue debt. We have to issue debt to pay for the expansion of the system. And then they reimburse the cost of that debt issuance. They actually pay that, it's kept in a fund. We say, in the example given here, we build an $8 million facility to expand our system. It doesn't really have to do with the development itself. It has to do with expanding our pipes so that we can serve those different developments. So we build an $8 million facility, we issue debt first to cover the cost, then we pay for the cost, and then later on we collect the EDUs from them. The other thing that probably could use a little clarification is if a developer comes and completes their project, they can't pay us for only a certain number of EDUs. They need to pay us for the entire amount of EDUs for that development that's been completed, if that's my understanding. Yep. So if there's a 300 EDU project and they complete it and they come to us and say, we want the water turned on, they have to pay us the full 300 EDUs, which is the 300 EDUs times the rate, which is the full amount that development costs. They can't pay us a portion of it.
At the first occupancy of the first home of the project?
They pay as they get occupancy, but if it's a condo unit, which a lot of them are, then if they are going to occupy one person in that condo, they have to pay for the whole unit. So they have to pay for everything.
And this is industry standard. I mean, Vallecitos isn't doing anything different than other water districts do. For those larger regional facilities, an agency may issue debt and then put the cost of that debt on the future development and collect it through capital facility fees at either occupancy or some point in the development process.
And just to clarify, for that infrastructure that you see that the developer is putting in, there's no debt, there's no exchange of money, there's nothing. They're putting it in for their purpose, for their needs, at their cost.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear from Donna Nickel.
I wasn't really prepared to speak. I was just going to ask a series of questions, so that may still be what I do. First of all, I agree with the previous speaker that I think it is time to do a hybrid situation where you have a buy-in, because I think we are at that point, because otherwise there shouldn't be a deficit in the cap fees. There shouldn't be that at all. And I also think that you should look harder at charging them on inception instead of occupancy, so that you do get the money up front, and that is allowable, and I think that is what it should be. And the other thing that I wanted to ask about was you keep talking about replacement fund. Isn't that fund all ratepayer money? Okay, so when you borrowed the paper money, wasn't that coming from ratepayer money for the capacity fees? It was, okay.
Well, point of correction, not
and
for the
so
capacity fees.
we, the ratepayers, loan developers the money. Well, you told me it was a paper loan, and it came from ratepayers, so we loaned the money to the developers.
Yeah, and it was paid back, the principal and the interest were all paid back. So it's as if
But
those funds were invested.
we were charged more money because you had to have a higher reserve account for ratepayers, did you not?
No,
Don't we have a high reserve for ratepayers?
No,
How much do we have for ratepayers in reserve?
well, you're asking two separate questions. You're
Yeah.
asking how much is in there?
Yes, I am.
And is it higher because of the deficit? The deficit has no impact, no bearing on the calculation of the ceiling or the floor of the reserves, zero. It's irrelevant, it's independent. That's what the policy says, it's not a factor that's considered.
Then how much do we have in reserves for ratepayers?
Wes, you have the number?
Well, in 2021, it was $101 million. It's somewhere around there now, 108 million maybe.
Sounds like an awful lot. And
It's within our policy
if
limit.
developers were paying their way at inception, would that not have been lower?
No, it would not have.
Wouldn't have affected
Doesn't
it
affect it.
one bit.
Two different accounts.
But you merged it when you loaned it to them. It doesn't seem that we needed to ever loan them money. They should be paying their way, and I guess that's a problem that we all have. Why do developers come first and ratepayers come second? We are the customers. We are the ones that hire you to serve us. We're not serving developers. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Just a quick point, if I could.
Yeah.
I said no to when she said, are we loaning money to developers? And I said no to that because we are using those funds, unrestricted funds, to construct district facilities using district resources. We never give the money to developers. There's never been a loan to developers, just for clarification.
Okay, thank you. Next is Tom Scaglione.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide a comment. At workshops and meetings and communications, you deny subsidizing developers with public money. You stated emphatically that ratepayers are not paying for development. And you stated that growth pays for growth. At a public meeting, your finance committee meeting, staff was directed to keep developer fees, quote, competitive. Subsequently, you reduced an anticipated developer fee adjustment by 69%. From that time, the developer fee adjustment was effective. The developer fund balance spiraled down from $11.8 million deficit to a $19.1 million deficit just before you issued the debt. That was July. For at least 10 years prior, you had no money in developer funds, never a surplus, to pay for developer obligations. And your only other available money was ratepayer money, public money. That sounds a lot like a subsidy. The use of public money by a government to keep a specific industry's fees, quote, competitive, end quote. In 2013, when developers started asking for accommodations where it was closed session, but 2 years later it was, I won't go over all the accommodations, but you know them. Staff report noted that, quote, request for deferral of payment is essentially asking ratepayers to subsidize development even further, end quote. The request was granted by the board, and the developer fund deficit continued to spiral downward. Ratepayers continued to subsidize development. More recently, the staff report for the developer fee adjustment noted that cap fees have no fiscal impact to ratepayers. The cap fees did not include the buy-in component recommended by your consultant. Recommendation was taken out of the final report put online. Revenue from the buy-in component could have offset water rate increases dollar for dollar. In addition to the foregone revenue from not having a buy-in component, the developer fund deficit spiraled down another $7.3 million. 2 months after the cap fee was effective, you increased water rates to include a $6.9 million, quote, transfer to capital reserve, end quote. The entire 5-year capital requirement for water was $16 million, and you had already had $32 million of ratepayer money to fund it at that point. That $6.9 million annually makes up 14.5% of our water bill, and you are using it to fund the developer's obligations. How is that not a fiscal impact to buyers? And growth isn't paying for growth. Certainly not all of it. We customers have been paying for more than 10 years, and now investors have paid for growth with this recent bond issuance. After borrowing $28 million from investors, you have $2.9 million surplus in developer money. How are you going to pay back $28 million on top of the other old debt? You have a $3.2 million debt payment in June, plus the additional debt service from your new debt. Plus, so will you continue to use ratepayer money to subsidize developers? June is, you're going to have your deficit again. I think I'm out of time, but I was going to address the buy-in component and some misinterpretation about how that's calculated. If I may have another minute, just to get an understanding of it.
Go ahead.
The buy-in component is mutually exclusive than the incremental cost component. The report that came out after the initial recommendation said, oh, there's a buy-in component because of the debt that's being paid by developers. Debt is excluded from a buy-in calculation. A buy-in calculation, and you don't need to wait for a master plan to add a buy-in component. A buy-in component is just the opposite of the incremental cost component. Buy-in component is based on, all you need to calculate the buy-in component is a depreciation schedule and your E&R factors. It is the value of your existing system minus debt. It's the net value. Buy-in does not, you don't pay for debt with the buy-in component. It's the value of your system minus your debt, so that's your net value of your system, and that's divided by the capacity in your system. Just it's the opposite of everything in the incremental cost component. It's all mutually exclusive. And so I can go over what that was, and maybe that was inadvertently provided to me, but I did get the original recommendation from Karen, and somehow that was eliminated in the one that made it to online. But I would be glad to, I don't mean to be adversarial, I mean to be helpful, and hopefully you can understand how important that is, that we haven't had that revenue from a buying component. As one speaker mentioned, only Carlsbad is the only other one, and they might have it, they don't even know what they have, but I know they have at least an incremental cost component, and we are the only one that does not have a buying component. Developers come in here and argue, you have plenty of capacity to service, you have plenty of capacity to service. Yes, we do have plenty of capacity, and they should be paying their fair share of replacement. They should be at the same par when they come and use our system. We have paid, you said ratepayers don't pay a dime for the infrastructure that's put in. Yes, we do. We keep it up, we pay for replacement and things like that. And that's where that revenue goes to from a buying component. It's two separate things. And that could help directly offset rates. That was something you had the opportunity to do a long time ago. You deferred increasing the cap fee. It was supposed to be 2016. You deferred that all the way to 2000. That would have been very helpful to have that in there, and it would have been very helpful to, for us customers to be able to offset that revenue. Director Hernandez, thank you so much for coming to my session I had at Aqua. I hope that was helpful, and if there's any questions on that, I'd be glad to answer it. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thanks, Tom. I'll let staff respond.
Well, I'll touch on one of the things Tom talked about at the end. He said that ratepayers do pay for the capacity in the new development. And he's confusing two things intentionally, I think. So we don't pay at all for the initial installation. And as James talked about, the developer pays 100% to build it, we inspect it, and then it gets turned over to us. At the point in time it gets turned over to us, then it's our infrastructure. And then it's treated like any other piece of pipe. And yes, the ratepayers pay for that, but it's part of the system then. He's intentionally confusing the fact that we don't pay for the installation. That's the point of what we've been saying. We don't pay for the installation 1 penny. And when it gets turned over to us, it's part of our inventory, and then we have to maintain it and replace it eventually, but not for the initial installation. Now, I'll look at James and Wes if there's other topics they want to
I'll
address.
just address one thing. So working with Karen Keys, we went through a whole buying component process of where, if it would make sense, because we were thinking, are we at the point where this makes sense? And this was independent of any community group or developer asking for one or other, because Karen brought this up and she's a rate consultant, and she looks at capacity fees all the time, and she's very well regarded in the industry. She made some assumptions on some of our numbers and said, hey, their buying component may make sense here. Once we clarified it, got into the numbers, she realized, oh no, if we continue with this, your capacity fees would actually be lower because it would exclude some of the other things because we're kind of double dipping. And that's the point of my presentation is when we looked at this really closely, we left ourselves vulnerable to challenge because of potential double dipping within the way it was formed. So then in the final study, she took that out because at that point she realized that some of the assumptions she made were not all correct, and that's partially staff's fault because we didn't give her all the information that we didn't understand to give her all the information. And when we got all the information to her, she actually recalculated everything and said, you know what, at this point you're not ready, but you may be ready soon. And we may be ready now, I don't know, but we may be ready soon. And at this point, our current fees have only been in place for less than 2 years, less than a year and a half.
And a lot of our major infrastructure is still being paid for through debt service that has remaining capacity. So we're still paying for it, developers are still paying for it in the CAFE model through that existing debt because it's still being paid off. We can't take our total assets and divide them by total units because we'd be charging them again for the same assets that are still being paid for in the CAFE model. That's what James means by double dipping, and we cannot do that, and that's what was determined during the CAFE study. Sorry.
Yeah, there was two examples that Mr. Scaglione referenced, work product that wasn't a final document. One is the Karen Keys. He looked at a preliminary report, and when it was finalized, yeah, the answer was different. It's very common that those answers change through the development. And he also mentioned the developers, that after the developers got involved, the cap fee, the actual calculation went down. That's true too, just like water rates. We issue preliminary water rates, and then as we refine the numbers, sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down from the preliminary recommendation. And that's what he's referring to. So he's looking at work product as it progresses and saying, you lowered the cap fee because of the developers. We didn't lower a cap fee because it was never adopted. It was never established. There was involvement, there was discussions, and we talked with our consultants that we worked with, and we calculated the fee. It ended up being different than the first number that we threw out there. That's not that uncommon.
Another thing I'd like to add was, it sounded like he was referring to the debt service as being sort of a negative thing, that we couldn't afford to pay the debt service. So we've revised our cap fee model and increased our capacity fee rates. The debt was issued, as I mentioned, like a low all-in cost of 2.24%. Our debt service costs are going to increase by $780,000 per year. And in 2 years, we have one of our debts dropping off, and the amount of payment on that is about $700,000. Our overall debt service costs will not increase, except for in the next 2 years. By 2031, it'll level out again when the 2015 bond actually goes down and the 2021 bond goes up. My point to that is, our overall debt service is pretty level. So this was a good idea, issuing this debt, and in no way was it harmful to the district.
All right, thank you. Let's hear from Susie Glass.
Thank you. First of all, here's your knowledge level. Most of us are lay people about here. I'm about down here. So I wish I'd have gone first, because I think I'm going to clarify, or at least ask. I'm a retired teacher. This is a true or false test of everybody, so make your answers short. Those EDUs, that means individual home units or individual living EDU, because you never said what that initials stood for there. The other thing I want to ask, when you say issue debt, that sounds fancy. Doesn't that just simply mean borrow money?
Yes, we have to
Yes.
go through a 6-month-long process.
So when I buy a new car, instead of borrowing money for that new car, I can just say, I issued debt for that new car? Okay, good. So I love that, and thank you for that, because that sure makes life simpler for me. I'm going to start saying I'm issuing debt everywhere.
Thank God it doesn't take 6 months to buy a car, though.
Well, 5, 6 years maybe. But the other thing I wanted to ask about, and even though I'm a conservative, I'm a very green person. I hate plastic bottles. I drink only tap water. I get a glass and I turn on the faucet. Number one, is it safe to do that? And number two, why don't you publicize that it's safe to do that? I had a maid that just came from Mexico, and she was buying water, and I said, Elda, what are you doing? And she goes, because I know her income is very small. And I said, the tap water. I could not get her to drink the tap water. And I went over and I'm drinking the tap water. And I guess being from, where you can't drink the tap water, but I see all these people with these plastic bottles that drive me crazy. I have a plastic bottle. I keep refilling it. I don't tell anybody that, but I use tap water. So is tap water safe? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So please advertise that out there so we can get rid of all these silly bottles.
And actually, we do. There's a consumer confidence report that we put out. Is it annually?
Yes.
And then it might be going twice a year. That tells you all the constituents in your water, what the regulations are, and how it's met or exceeded.
That comes in your water bill once a year.
Yeah.
So don't
I don't read it.
Don't
You
throw that
mean-
stuff away.
And I'm a
I'll
walking,
issue debt on my water bill for you. How about that?
and I'm a
Yeah.
walking advertisement for it. I actually bring this every night.
Okay. And my last question, when you said it was, and this, again, a true or false here, so it's an easy test. When you said that it's better for Vallecitos to get the money from the builders at occupation rather than inception, it's because you plan on raising your rates in those 3 years? Is that where that came from? So if you keep your rates the same,
But there's an automatic escalator.
Policy.
so the only way it's profitable to wait 3 years is simply because you're going to be asking for more, just like steak's going to be more in 3 years.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's the capacity fee you're talking about.
That's
Right.
capacity.
Yeah,
That's only for developers.
Yes.
Right.
It's not,
Okay.
it's not water rates.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so even if we don't do a master plan and we don't do a cap fee study, we do increase the capital facility fee every year on January 1st by it's a construction index called the Engineering
Inflation.
News Record.
Inflation.
Thank you all
It's
very
an
much.
inflation
I
index.
appreciate you.
Thank you, Susie. Good seeing you again.
Thanks,
And
Susie.
we just, because you brought up some other concerns that were a little unrelated to the capacity fee issue, but these are actually, we have a no plastic single-use bottle policy here at the district now, and these are actually made out of some kind of super duper recyclable, they're not plastic, so. And then I think Susie brought up a good point. I know we do we push out annually, our water quality report, but we have this award-winning, literally no exaggeration, award-winning public relations team that does a phenomenal job of messaging all kinds of things out to our customers and our community. I think we need to maybe kind of drop a little hint that, hey, when I first was on the board, they were really focused on the value of water, talking about how tap water is 1 penny
Less than.
less than a penny per gallon, which if you compare that to gasoline or milk or anything else, there's a lot of value there. And they did a really good job with that. Value is not always necessarily the same as quality, and we hear that a lot. I think tap water kind of gets a bad rap, right? And probably wrongfully so, because when we look at it from a biological standpoint, it's as clean as any water out there. And so we could do a better job with that. That was good feedback. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm out of speaker slips, but I'll invite anyone else up to the podium that wants to speak. So now's your chance, except for Tom.
Can I come up and just clarify something about?
Sure, go ahead.
If you calculate the incremental cost component and the buying component correctly, there is no double dipping. It's mutually exclusive things. The incremental cost component is only forward-looking. That's why I use the master plan. You don't use the master plan at all for the buy-in component, not at all.
So quick question though, if you do this, would you take the debt costs out of your cap fee calculation?
You take it out of the buy-in. You do not include it in the buy-in, so you don't double dip.
But the buy-in doesn't include it by nature, it's the total cost of assets.
That's how you calculate the buy-in.
But the cap fee model actually has our existing debt, which is paying for the Metal Arc plant, the
correct.
Twin Oak Reservoir number 1 and 2. They're still being paid for through that debt. If you put them in the total cost of assets, you're double dipping, I believe.
No, you're taking them out of the cost of assets.
So you're taking them out
The
of
buying
one.
component is the value minus debt. So that way you don't double dip.
And actually, Tom's correct, and what Karen Keys said was the problem that we have is we don't have a lot of assets that have excess capacity that we could be vetted if challenged. And that's where she stopped. So she made an assumption that we do, because when we were coming out of the recession, we had lower water use than expected, and we had infrastructure that we built back in '05 to '08. But then looking at the infrastructure and the modeling and the master plan, the way it was laid out, it doesn't vet out. And that's where it went from a work product to the final product.
For the audience benefit, can you explain who Karen Keys is?
Yeah, so Karen Keys was our consultant, our professional consultant that we used to do the Nexus study, that rate model. She put together from the master plan, the capacity fee study, which basically allocated all those costs, the whole presentation I went through, and figure out this is how you collect. And basically, the end result is she based what our cap fees are today, or the foundation of our cap fees today. And that's who Karen Keys are. So it wasn't staff doing it, it was a consultant that does it for many agencies. And I used to work at another agency called Otay Water District, that's a tremendous growth agency. And she did it for Otay also, and we're a growth agency also.
And just to add, Otay now does the buying, you know that? Not from Karen. Karen does a great job. She did say originally in that if you're over 50% filled out, many agencies use a buying component. And we were well over 50% built out at that point, 65% for sewer, wasn't 60% for water, I think. And you mentioned that, I know it's a big concern over here about challenging, right? Challenges to rates, either capacity fees, that's a huge one, right? Because what will developers do? For Cantuck or bam, they'll sue at a drop of a hat, right, if you add a buying component. But you know what, without a buying component, ratepayers could challenge it too. So there should be a concern for ratepayers. We need a buying component, it makes sense, it was recommended by Karen. The specific language she used was 50% or more build out, you should be using a buying component. And everybody else is, even growth agencies are, and we have plenty of capacity. It can be challenged by ratepayers, but there doesn't seem to be a concern about ratepayers challenging it, but there certainly is a concern about developers challenging it. We need a buying component, we need it now. We've been losing a lot of revenue by not having it. We're the only ones in Carlsbad. By contrast, Carlsbad is the only one with the incremental cost method method, and they have $37 million surplus. We have a $2.9 million surplus. That's going to be gone in June. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Anyone want to respond further?
I don't know that there's anything
we're
specific
kinda
to
going
respond
in
to.
circles.
There's no action required of the board today. This is an informational workshop. I think staff kind of talked about the next steps that we will be taking, and we still plan to go forward with those, so.
Sorry, if I could real quick, it sounds like we're still referring to a preliminary version of our capacity fee study, which was later changed based on new information and going through the process. Our cap fee study and our capacity fee rate were vetted by our consultants and by our attorneys. And it went through the board, like we've all discussed this, through 6 different capacity fee meetings. So one person's point of view may not necessarily be the correct point of view.
Sure. Understand.
I'd just like to say a few words. First, I want to say thank you to all of you that came out tonight. I'm leaving here very optimistic. I think that we had a civil discussion tonight. I think we asked a lot of questions, and I'm not sure that you got all the answers you were looking for, but we made progress. I'm very optimistic. I think we learned that in the past, there have been some practices that have been corrected going forward. And I think that that's good. That's good for us as ratepayers. I'm a ratepayer too. If you find that you didn't have your questions answered, the election is November 8th. You can vote. That's one way that you can express your opinion. All of our financial filings are available. They are public record. You can look and see who donates to our campaigns. I encourage you to do that. Thank you for coming. Thank you for voicing your opinion. Thank you for making democracy work. Thank you.
Okay, any other board comments? Okay, I think we're at the end of our agenda, so we're adjourned.
Thank you for coming.